Partially Examined Life relies on your support. To find out how to help in ways that are cheap or even free for you, check out partiallyexaminedlife.com/support.
This episode of Partially Examined Life is brought to you by St. John's College Graduate Institute, offering discussion-based master's degree programs for Western liberal arts or Eastern classics. Go to partiallyexaminedlife.com/SJCGI for more information.
Hey folks, you're listening to a reissue episode, one of our things from way back in the day. This is Mark Linsenmeyer, a decade later.
Has it been a decade?
2010.
Wow, this is that early?
Yes.
It's amazing.
And it had a guest who has since disappeared into the ether. Seth. This is Seth in Austin.
This is Wes in Cambridge.
And are you also a decade later?
9 years older than I was on that episode. That's correct.
That's amazing.
I will say this. A lot has happened in those 9 years.
This has been available only to Partially Examined Life citizens, but we're about to have, the next 2 months are going to be filled in your feeds with Philosophy of Mind things. We're finally following up on this initial outing. We've sort of put little toes into the area of Philosophy of Mind with other episodes, but not full on taking on the mind-body problem and related stuff.
Yes, we are now inserting ourselves into the Iron Maiden that is Philosophy of Mind. Closing the door.
And apparently I didn't learn from the lesson that this episode you're about to hear. We chose 5 papers, and well, the one you're going to hear after this, I chose only 3, but really we only could fit 1 paper in a full 2-hour conversation because they were difficult ones. So I still am choosing 9 years later, too many things to fit into one episode.
Some things never change.
So what did you think of this, Seth?
So listening to it again, it wasn't as much of a textual deep dive as we've been wont to do in other episodes. It seemed to be more of a survey of various positions, which is reflective both of the reading, the style of philosophy that's being done in that space, and the just sheer lack of consensus and general thread. It's a hard problem. It's a hard subject. And at least at the time, I think, part of it was we were looking at readings that were canonical in the philosophical discipline, but maybe not necessarily as current, up-to-date, even 9 years ago as what was happening in the discipline itself with the combination. We talked about how when we were in school, there was cognitive science and philosophy and logic and computer science and all these different disciplines. And now it's probably expanded and there's, neurophysiology and neuropsychology and all this other stuff. And so it struck me as like a good introduction to the general questions and various positions taken against those. But I can't imagine that there isn't light years worth of material and stuff between us now and then, even as there might have been between what we read and the time we recorded. But one would have to dedicate oneself strictly to this topic to be able to stay current on everything that I'm sure is impacting it.
What was your impression, Wes? Is this one we're recommending to people?
Well, I thought you did a great job of explaining a lot of stuff.
I read way too much.
Yeah, I thought you were very clear. You were explaining things. I didn't have a similar opinion about myself. I was just doing what I say that I don't like people to do, which is just being contrary and expressing my displeasure about Dennett and Ryle.
That was highly entertaining, by the way. I just have to say that. Thank you for reminding me.
It is something people comment on a lot, but it wasn't entertaining for me to listen to. I finally, I listened to all but 20 minutes. The last 20 minutes of the episode, I was so unable to listen to myself talk. I was turning down the volume way down when I talked. So it wouldn't hurt as much. But with 20 minutes to spare on the episode, I couldn't take listening to myself anymore.
Well, I think you're being unfair to yourself, but...
So hopefully over 9 years, I've improved. But yeah.
I knew at the time that these readings talk past each other. And so we, in turn, I think we're talking past each other to some extent, just because, as Seth said, we were not actually hefting a particular argument in detail and throwing it around. It was more mentioning them, pointing at them, getting the positions out, but not really delving into them far enough to actually feel like you could judge the thing one way or other. And I still feel that way now as I'm reading articles that are actually specifically responding to each other, that so much of this comes down to intuitions about truths across possible worlds and things like that, that takes quite a lot of philosophy, some of which is very technical, to try to get to the bottom of like, well, what would possibly support an intuition either way? Could there be zombies? In other words, creatures that are exactly like me physically, but don't have the inner light of consciousness? Is that, even if it's not scientifically possible, is it even conceptually possible? I don't know. But that's the way, at least Chalmers, that we're going to talk about, breaks down the various positions, is your intuition about that particular thing. So I think we're going to do better this time around. And I think what folks are about to hear is a nice introduction to it. One little detail, I keep bringing up this guy. I just gotten this book by Zoltan Torey. And the position that I'm referring to, that I'm attributing to him, is called higher order thought, theories of consciousness. So if you look up hot theories, I don't know if we're going to get around to talking about that in our upcoming episodes here, but if folks are curious about that, that is the reference. I'll put some links in the show notes here.
Well, one of the things that stuck out hearing it again was that Wes was fairly adamant that he felt like there was a question out there that wasn't going to get solved by science, that wasn't going to get solved by empirical investigation. And I'll be curious to see, I think I was in agreement, or at least sympathetic to that. And I'll be curious to see if 10 years on or 9 years on, after reading this other stuff, we still feel the same way.
Strangely enough, I feel that uncontroversially that way as well. I'm actually on the Chalmers side. There's complexities to that, but the idea that you can't just ignore the idea of qualia, that there's a way that experience seems to you, and that's his whole description of what the hard problem of consciousness is. I certainly don't think that's the only work to be done, and Chalmers doesn't think that either. But yeah, I more just recognize that some of these folks, like Dennett and Chalmers, are just dealing with kind of different questions and ignoring the other person's question, perhaps, as opposed to actually disagreeing.
Yeah. One of the examples used in was about, I don't remember who it came from, but the idea that if somebody who was blind but was an expert in color theory, if they were suddenly to be given sight and have the actual experience of color, red, I'm sure, was the assumed color, that you can't say that there wouldn't be something incremental or additional that would be added to their experience or their knowledge. And I find that so compelling, it's hard for me to think otherwise. It would be very interesting for somebody to come at the qualia question from that perspective, and it's intuitively strong.
I think you're right, Seth. I think it is a very compelling argument. It's difficult to know how to interpret the result of it, because as Mark was in this episode from long ago, Mark was actually describing the point of view that Block describes in this paper that we're going to be discussing, which is that even if there's something new in actually having the experience of the color red, it's not a new fact. That's one way of putting this. It's more like a new concept of the same thing than a new concept of a new thing, which I intuitively don't buy it and I have to think about it. But I think it's interesting to me how much of this original, so in the recording that we've already done, we were talking explicitly about Chalmers, and of course we're referring to him. I don't think we officially did anything by Chalmers, right, for this episode.
Right, it was kind of optional.
But I had forgotten all that. I'd forgotten that we'd actually talked about all this stuff. And I think we rehash it in the first of our new Philosophy of Mind episodes. We take more time to clearly lay out all of that stuff, and that'll be a good springboard for what we're going to do afterwards. So,
well, at the very least, I think that what people are about to hear was exciting. It was exciting for us to do at the time. It was an exciting new area. It might have soured me on doing anything in that area for 9 years, but it's a good appetizer. So.
Time heals all wounds. Were you sour just because I had a bad attitude?
I don't totally remember now but I think my immediate reaction, why I didn't want to do more right away. Well, I think part of it, I actually did ask Marco, our guest here, to come back and do Chalmers' longer book, and he bought it and he never read it. There were delays I will blame on him. I ended up doing it as a Not School group, so I'm going to post that discussion from the Not School group in the $1 Patreon thing, and it's up for PL citizens as well. So it's, of course, terrible sound quality, and it's listeners talking with me as opposed to you guys, so it's not nearly as good, but you can get some idea. So I was still interested in it for a while, and I just don't remember all the factors that went into us completely ignoring it. Just there's always another more important thing. That's just why we put off any topic that we put off for many, many years. We are easily distracted, easily tempted by the fruits, the various fruits.
Well, I wouldn't say we're easily tempted. I would just say that it's an indication of how deep the mine and the vein is that we can continue to mine it and skip this or that thing and still have. If we'd run lean and thin and been gasping for air, we would have redirected back towards this. But now we're here, and so is it.
Yep.
By the way, it looks like Marco's still at Stanford.
Excellent. All right, thanks for coming down memory lane with me. Hope folks like it.
Yep. Enjoy. Younger us.
You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, a philosophy podcast by some guys who at one point set on doing philosophy for a living, but then thought better of it. This is episode 21, where we approach the question, what is mind? By talking about several articles, including Alan Turing's 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, a chapter from Gilbert Ryle's 1949 book, The Concept of Mind, called Descartes' Myth, and then some sort of responses to the ideas put forward in those that are more or less trying to reduce mind to something physical or something functional or something like that. Thomas Nagel's 1974 essay, What is it like to be a bat? John Searle's Chinese room argument, as discussed in a 1980 piece, Minds, Brains, and Programs, and then a response to those somewhat, Daniel C. Dennett's Quining Qualia from 1988. So we'll have links to all of those on the web at partiallyexaminedlife.com, as well as our ever-exciting blog and other cool things. My name is Mark Linton-Meyer, thinking aloud from Madison, Wisconsin.
This is Seth Paskin, participating from Austin, Texas.
This is Wes Baldwin in Boston, Massachusetts.
And my name is Marco Wise, and I'm calling from the San Francisco Bay Area.
All right.
Can you please be more specific?
No, just in case I say something that pisses somebody off, I want them to be able to find me.
We're going to post your address.
It's not his real name, by the way, listeners. So.
That's right.
So Marco was one of the first people I met when checking out UT as a school to potentially go to.
That's right. We were wined and dined by the chair, I think, of the department. They took us out to a nice place to eat, and then he took us on the most scenic route to get there, just to get us all excited about where we would be living, and then basically told us, well, there's no way you guys could ever afford to live in this particular part of town, but it's really nice. Yeah, and I think we also spent, I think he dropped us off on 6th Street after that, and then we hopped from bar to bar.
The famous live music capital of the world, when it was still cool in 1994.
It still is cool.
Well, even when I was down there, like when we went, it was like a Tuesday night, and every single place on 6th Street had music in it and was full of people.
Yes.
And you could go upstairs in some of the places and there'd be different music. It was unreal. And even during the time I was there, by 98 or so, a lot of those places had closed, just there weren't the kind of crowds, at least on the weekdays, like that.
Right.
So, and I think it's a national trend. It wasn't just Austin. It's just been a national live music venue issue. And then Marco and Wes and I hung out a lot, our first few years especially, when Wes and I were living together.
That's right. I think I met Wes in front of the student union through you, right? Is that
probably
ring a bell? Yeah. Then lots of coffee.
We hung out a lot there. Get coffees.
Tried lots of coffee places. It was fun. It's actually one of my favorite memories of graduate school, just hanging out and talking about philosophy with you guys.
Yeah.
Right. So we're very happy that you could rejoin us for this, and we especially thought Marco would be appropriate for this Philosophy of Mind episode because, let's see, he and I both sort of started in the track of cognitive science, which is I don't know if it's still considered the same way, but it was really this interdisciplinary thing with artificial intelligence and psychology and a little bit of philosophy. Sometimes a philosophy professor would be involved, but sometimes not.
Right.
So we took a cog-sci course together, and then I kind of got out of that a little bit. But you went whole hog into the computer thing and learned formal logic and programming in Lisp and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I sort of worked much more on the programming side and the pure AI type of work. And I moved away from cognitive science towards the end and just got much more interested in the tools involved, the programming tools and Lisp and various languages. So I moved away from cognitive science as well, but instead of moving back towards philosophy, I think I spent my last 2 years there almost all the time in the computer science department. I think at one point one of the professors remarked that I should just move my mailbox on that side because they would never see me.
Probably said with envy.
Why did you?
Towards the end of my tenure there, it seemed that all the philosophy guys who were trying to do formal logic and all that stuff were just envious of the computer science and cog-sci because those guys, had legitimacy and funding.
Yeah, it's definitely true. There were a lot of philosophers working on that when I got there, and I think it was one of the reasons why I chose UT over some of the other schools.
And now, professionally, Marco, you are a computer guy, but not doing artificial intelligence, right? Doing web work.
Yeah, I do web work for Central IT at Stanford University and basically work on getting our information online in different ways and also helping other groups get their information online. There's a lot of programming. There's quite a bit of just looking at our infrastructure and trying to figure out ways to make it easier for others to do what we do. It's quite interesting. I really enjoy what I do there. One of the bonuses is that I also get to be in an academic environment. It's one of the things I missed at first when I left UT.
And do you regret moving away from philosophy, not pursuing the PhD?
Well, I wouldn't say I regret not pursuing it. I still think that maybe eventually I'll work on it and get the degree. What I do regret is not touching a philosophy book for the past 10 years. I started dusting off some of the ones that I had because of these podcasts, but really for the past 10 years, I haven't looked at any of this stuff.
Really? So have you actually read the assignments for a couple of these episodes?
No.
Okay. Oh,
just this one.
No,
just this one.
Nobody does that, right? Okay.
Yeah.
We don't even do that.
Is that how it's supposed to work?
We're supposed to read things? That was our imagination when we started this, that we'll just have a short article and we'll kind of put it on the blog plenty in advance and people will read it and then they'll listen to us and I don't know, maybe a couple people do that. I'd be interested in hearing on the blog or on the Facebook discussion site if anybody's actually doing that. From what I understand, it's more, oh, you guys said some cool stuff about Hobbes. This made me actually look at Hobbes a little bit. Not, oh, I wanted to be prepared for your discussion, so I read the Hobbes. No. That's too much pressure.
Not to mention the proliferation that Mark has introduced into because he's a voracious reader.
Well, there has been some evolution about that in that when I started, I really thought this was going to be we'll read something really short and just kind of bullshit about it and, not take notes or anything. But you guys upped my game. Wes would come in all prepared with all the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy stuff. Seth, you've revealed your method on the blog of how you make these detailed color-coded notes of pulling out the quotes
diagrams.
But not of multiple readings, just of the one specific text, What can I say, man? Deep reading.
And once I got into this, then I was like, this is my opportunity. If we're doing one Nietzsche episode or whatever, when are we going to do Nietzsche again? Maybe not for another year. So I just wanted to, if we have 3 weeks to read it, rather than, in fact, I've been not so much reading the same article multiple times to be able to talk about it intelligently, but just read more by that person if I have time. Because I just want to get the most refreshment out of it. I'm enjoying it. That's all.
Yeah, I found I had to do that same kind of thing actually with these readings. You start reading some of these and then they mention some ism that you haven't heard in a while or perhaps never heard of before, and so you start looking that up and then next thing you know, you're reading a completely different paper and that points you to something else. It's kind of like the web, right? Except there's no links to between these articles. I shouldn't have printed them.
Well, they're often ours, but...
Yeah, well, I printed some of these, so that was a problem.
Well, it's also a quarter, at least a fifth, I would say, of my philosophy books are philosophy of mind related. That was one of my, as a potential cog-sci person, was one of the things I was invested into. Not that I remember a lot of them, but so I really used this time. We had an extra long time this time. We had over 4 weeks, right, since the last recording. So I just really immersed myself in this stuff. Plus, it was way last summer. We were actually planning on doing this originally. So I sort of dipped already into that at that point. And then, I don't know, Wes and I were fighting too much online about what we were going to read or something. And Seth said, not now. Let's read some other stuff.
Wait, what were we fighting about?
I think it was the same thing, that, your irrational hatred of Dan Dennett, who I think is perfectly fine.
It had everything to do with Dan Dennett, whose name you're hardly able to speak without adding an expletive.
I think it's more about his style than anything, so it's not... Okay. We're probably not as far apart on any substantive issues as...
Right, well, that's what I figure, but it also, if you read something and say, this is absolutely worthless, there's not even a single argument in there...
Yeah, I regretted sending that. I regretted that.
That's all right. It's email. But then if I read it and I'm finding it reasonable, I mean, is there something wrong with my faculty of judgment? I don't know. But on the other hand, some of the philosophers, at least we're reading, approach this topic as meta-science. In some areas, philosophy is just kind of science before it's figured out what it's doing. Right? That's what all, old-time astronomy, old-time chemistry, they were all philosophy when they started. And mind is still definitely at that point, which means a lot of these guys are trying to work with scientists and really get themselves informed by psychologists, by guys in artificial intelligence, the whole cognitive science thing we're talking about, which means, first, the stuff is going to get out of date much quicker. And all the stuff we're reading is fairly recent in the first place, actually since 1950. Who knows if anybody's going to read any of this stuff 50 or 100 years from now. It's not like Descartes or whatever that's already in stone. And also, I don't feel very competent when somebody says, oh, based on all the neuroscience and psychology that I've been reading, here's what I think is a reasonable model for the mind. I don't really have good criteria for deciding whether their judgment is good in that respect. All I know is which experiments they're telling me about and whether what they're saying sort of makes sense, and I can sort of judge the degree to which they seem to be engaging with the literature as a whole and the degree to which they seem to work hard.
I mean, there's questions of internal coherence and things like that. I don't think you have to be a scientist to evaluate arguments in which science are used. You take the experiments as a given. You accept entirely any scientific evidence they're offering, but that's generally not what's at issue. It's the consequences that you can draw from that. So, Dennett gives some experiment and then draws some absurd consequences from it that everyone else rejects. And then I read other papers where people who are far more steeped in all this stuff give very convincing rebuttals, and it confirms my intuition that something was wrong there, or my sort of rough argument that I hadn't really chiseled out. Now, many of these people are very charitable to Dennett, including Nagel, by the way, who in his Nagel's Review of Consciousness Explained is very, very kind and complimentary. But there are other philosophers of mind, like Colin McGinn, who just
I don't know him.
Despise Dennett as much as I do. And McGinn sort of has a dualist tendency.
Mm-hmm. So Wes and I, we decided to experiment with this one, or at least I decided, which is to, instead of saving everything for the podcast, just let's email it a lot in advance just to sort of practice these things and get some things out. But we know that we're not going to resolve a lot of our issues, which might just mean there'll be a future episode covering more of this stuff, reading some of the books, some of these authors, maybe whole books by them or whatever. I'm not going to make you read a whole Dennett book, but maybe. We'll see. Also, we'll have some more follow-up probably on the blog. I was thinking of posting some mini reviews of some of these books that I've been thumbing through, like the David Chalmers, The Conscious Mind, or Zoltan Torres, The Crucible of Consciousness, which is one I picked up just because it was really current. It was 2009, only to learn that it was actually originally written in 1999 and was just picked up by MIT Press in 2009. So I still don't know what's going on right now in the area. It seems most of the references are to these things from the 90s at best.
Yeah, I think Chalmers is where it's at. Right. And he incorporates Dennett and others, and, he's sort of a synthesizer.
Yeah, so that's David Chalmers.
Even though, obviously, he has his own big monist panpsychical view, which is really, I think, the most appealing one.
Yeah, we'll put up there's already a link up for a paper by him called Consciousness and Its Place in Nature, which it's supposed to just sort of go through the various positions and sum them up. So it's a nice, as well as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy thing, is a nice overview of some of these positions. Another short book that maybe I'll put a link to that I was reading for this, because I think I read it in the first place. That's how I learned some of these things, is Paul Churchland's Matter and Consciousness, which I think even in a much more straightforward way goes through the various, here's substance dualism, here's property dualism, here's functionalism, here's eliminative materialism and these things, and gives good descriptions and arguments for and against them. The Churchland one is from 84. Not too current. So before we dive in, I mean, what are your backgrounds? Like, Seth, where are you at with this? Did you ever take any of these, a Phil Mind course at the time, or?
No. I studied logic, and I knew a lot about not cog-sci, but computer science, and ended up, of course, going to work in technology and doing that sort of thing. But I never studied any formal philosophy of mind or any cognitive science or anything like that. I had written my undergraduate thesis on modality and logic, and so I understood some of the issues that were involved, but particularly on the subject of dualism and the mind-body problem, I have literally very little exposure. So when I was, of course, doing all the background reading and I was deciding what I was going to spend a little extra time on, I focused on the Turing stuff. So I suspect that I will have very little to contribute tonight.
Well, what was as one who's maybe less tainted than we are, any overall reactions? What did you enjoy, not enjoy about what was going on here?
I think the question is fascinating, and I think it's exactly the problem that it's made out to be. It seems like it's one of those things that is truly perplexing, and when people say it's still one of the critical issues in philosophy, I agree. And what I thought was interesting, Mark, is on an email exchange earlier, you said something about how talking to your friends and family or whatever, they just don't get it, or they don't seem to understand the...
Oh, that was me, actually.
Yeah, was it you?
Yeah.
That students, when in intro courses, tend not to understand.
No, not just intro courses, just people, office coworkers and things like that. I used to, over drinks, try and get into it. And I think a lot of people, it doesn't even register that there is a problem.
Do you want to tell us why there's a problem to start us off then?
Okay. Throughout history, no. I think the basic problem is that there's some beings for whom there's what it's like to be. So while a rock is non-sentient, sentient beings generally, say a bat or a human being, there's a what it's like to be in the sense of having a subjective experience or a bodily sensation, and so on and so forth. Now, the confusing thing is that human beings are composed of physical substances which themselves don't have that quality of being for, right? And generally we expect that the properties of a whole have some derivable relationship to the properties of the parts. But where atoms and chemicals aren't in themselves conscious, they somehow give rise to a whole which has consciousness. So I think that's one way of describing the problem. And there are a few other, I think, intuitive thought experiments, which we could, I don't know if we want to give those now or later.
Well, it's interesting that, the problem has itself evolved, that the issue was originally not just what is it like to be something? That's the way Thomas Nagel, whose article we read, puts it. But it was more thinking in general, where Descartes, at least, is often described as thinking that everything mental is conscious. Whereas now, with the rise of Freud and psychology, we think a lot of what we might call thinking, information processing, right? How we recognize something to be what it is not conscious at all. This is something that is computational, maybe. So the whole notion of mind has been separated to some extent from the notion of consciousness. And I was really struck by this when I took a philosophy of mind class, how a lot of time it was like, well, what are the steps that we go through to understand a story or something? Can we program these into a computer and have the computer understand the story in some way? And it wasn't really touching on our conscious experience of what it's like to be something at all. So just the fact that there's been that shift, that now we think, oh, matter can contain information. It can do information processing, right? Computers do that all the time. So that's not such a mystery. What remains the mystery is consciousness.
Well, I think even calling it information can be a word that's equivocated, right? Because then we get into the whole problem of semantics. But I think we should wait until we get to the Chinese room to do that.
I feel like you guys might have it's already more complicated than I thought it was.
I wanted to step back to Descartes, though, because I think we should say what his view was. But Seth, did you?
I want to hear what Seth thinks the simple way of putting it is.
So, we talk about there being a mind-body problem. So the question is, what's the problem? Well, the problem is your body is physical. It exists in space and time. It's subject to physical laws. You can be pushed around. You can be forcibly restrained and all that. But we think there's such a thing as we have a mind, and the mind has ideas or something, states as emotions, whatever. And those things, they might be in time, but they're not in space. So
this is actually Descartes' formulation.
There you go. And what's weird is you say, okay, well, ideas are not spatiotemporal. They're not physical.
Right.
Yet somehow we have this head that contains all this stuff, but it's kind of not containing it. And then the question is, well, how do those things that are not really spatiotemporal and not really physical actually make you lift your arm and grab a glass or fall in love or something like that? It's this weird disconnect between these physical and this non-physical thing that we think can influence and control it. And it's giantly perplexing. It is a very difficult thing to understand. And if you say, well, we have a brain and the brain does the controlling, you've just inserted another level and you still have to figure out how the mind connects to the brain.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's a problem of going both ways. How does the mind affect the body and how does the body affect the mind?
And for Descartes, he gives two arguments for the whole idea that mind and matter are radically separate. One of them comes out of his clear and distinct ideas thing. So his premises are, I have a clear and distinct idea of the mind as a thinking, non-extended thing, so non-spatial.
Cannot be cut into pieces.
That's actually another argument. So that's the second one. So the first argument, the mind is non-extended, and that's its essence. The body's essence is to be extended, and so they must be different substances because things that have different essences must have different substances. So that's how we get what's called substance dualism, where there are two basic entities in the world. Yeah, and then the other argument is that the mind is indivisible. We experience ourselves as a whole in a sense. The body is divisible, and those are their essences, and so they must be different. One thing I do want to say is that Descartes didn't say that everything mental is conscious. So, for instance, here's a quote. There's a lot of things arise, he says, from the intimate union of mind and body, like appetites, hunger, and so on, emotions, passions. So he's actually not as straightforward about what consciousness is as I think some of the caricatures of him have to be.
Well, he believes that there's a lot of mechanism, like when you feel an emotion, I believe he said, some impression puts itself on the pineal gland, the little part of the brain that he identified, which is not important. It's just a thing to snicker about, of how he thinks the mind and the brain connected. And if it's a particularly scary thing, then, well, the mind itself, the soul that is attached, this mental substance, is the thing that gets scared. However, at the same time, this perception somehow causes juices in the body to start flowing so that our heart gets faster, and a lot of the physical things that we would attribute to emotion are actually just caused entirely mechanically. And once he introduces that, then he's able to say animals, he thinks, don't have a mind, don't have a spiritual substance that's connected in this way, but they do have a lot of the same mechanisms going on. So they could appear to be in pain, they could thrash around, they could sweat, they could do all these things, but it's pure mechanism. Certainly it's not conscious.
Well, let me read to you from one of his letters, just because you get more than the pineal gland, and I mean the pineal gland, yeah, that's a glaring thing that people.
Is it a letter to you?
But he wrote me a letter. It's to the Partially Examined Life, but he wrote it to me, emailed it to me specifically. No, but it said, but we also experience within ourselves certain other things which must not be referred either to the mind alone or to the body alone. These arise, as will be made clear in the appropriate place, from the close and intimate union of our mind with the body. This list includes first, appetites like hunger, secondly, the emotions or passions, and so on and so forth. That's kind of a side thing, but I have always had the need to defend Descartes. But one of the other things is we should know what motivated Descartes' mind-body dualism, which is that he was reacting to a scholastic Aristotelian tradition in light of advances in modern science. So he wanted to get rid of final cause explanations from the description of physical phenomena. So, for instance, gravity is because there's a final cause tendency for things to go to the center of the earth. He thought people were attributing mental qualities to physical phenomena in order to explain them. So he wants to separate those for scientific reasons as well as arguably for religious reasons.
So do you think that Ryle's characterization of Descartes is pretty good? Is on the money? It sounds like it is in many ways.
I don't think it's about Descartes.
The chapter of the Gilbert Ryle book that we read, The Concept of Mind, he has a whole thesis in there, a behaviorist thesis that we didn't read and we're not really going to go into. But the chapter we read, Descartes' Myth, a lot of it was just spent describing the Cartesian view, which again, I don't think necessarily has to be, it doesn't even matter if it's something that's exactly what Descartes says.
Sure.
That at the time that Ryle was writing, what he thought the standard view that everybody believed, the establishment view. which is never as good as what Descartes himself actually said, or whoever, Aristotle.
Well, it's just not Descartes specifically. It's dualism and what he thinks dualism in general is. We'll describe Ryle's position first, and then I'll give you my response to it. But I don't think he's second on my list after Dennett of intellectual enemies. What do you take his argument to be, Marco?
He spent some time going over what he calls the official doctrine. And then what I found interesting was the position where it says that he tries to explain, after he talks about how absurd it is, goes into the origin of this. And it sounded like he was characterizing somebody like Descartes being conflicted between both wanting to say that there are mechanical rules for the body and so on, and that there is something similar going on in the mind. But the way I read it was because he said that Descartes had some other beliefs, perhaps the belief in God and so on, or religious beliefs, that he couldn't go that far. He couldn't actually say that everything that goes on in his mind was actually the same kind of thing that was going on in his body. And so, according to Ryle, it seems like Descartes basically had to sort of take an escape route by just denying what he knew about, as a scienceman, what he knew about the body and the mechanical rules, and just say basically, well, the mind is non-mechanical. While the body's in space, the mind isn't in space. And so he came up with this whole idea of the mind as just being something that's in some ways opposite to the body. It's defined by what it's opposite about it, but it also at the same time is somehow in the same category. It's similar. It's the same kind of thing. It still has laws. It still has this kind of organization. But it's not. It's a different substance, right? And that's then the problem, of course, is how do these two interact with one another?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the way he talks about it, right? He thinks that the dualists went wrong when they were looking for a functional description, and they ended up with a causal hypothesis, an illegitimate causal hypothesis. So if you're looking to talk about mental conduct predicates, you can do that according to Ryle in terms of dispositions. You don't need this occult cause. And Descartes went wrong because where he should have been looking for a criterion to distinguish intelligent from non-intelligent behavior, he got mixed up and looked to get at this cause, and that cause had to be reified like a physical object, and yet it was invisible and ghostly and so on and so forth.
That's right. And he calls that category mistake.
Right.
Right. And in Descartes' defense, it sure seems like I cause my own will. I want to think of an elephant. Bam, there's a picture of an elephant in my head. Like, it seems like we witness causality in our heads all the time, but it's obviously different than the causality that we see in the external world. So we've talked about that in terms of Kant's analysis and stuff. So it does seem like there are causal laws for both of these areas. But I picked this because I felt like he was representative of one of the major strains of people writing about philosophy of mind, where they see this fundamental problem that whether Descartes caused it or not, who knows, but that arose out of this view of Descartes, and they just find it intolerable. They find that if you're going to posit a substance, a spiritual substance, to be the mind, when really we don't know what's going on. Again, just going a little farther in the way Kant would look at it, well, we've got these mental appearances, we have no idea what's going on behind it. So to posit an actual mental substance, right, Kant doesn't want to do that. He's going to be a skeptic about this.
But Ryle is arguing not just against substance dualism.
Well, that's what he talks about, and okay. I don't think people have thought through these other kinds of dualism that are maybe more reasonable.
Okay.
And this is, I think, maybe where our big disagreement sort of before reading this came in, is that I feel like the enemy of just about everybody that we read for this time is substance dualism. It's not all kinds of dualism. Not everybody like Ryle thinks we have to get rid of mental talk altogether or deny that we're conscious beings or something like that. It's just this idea that Descartes put forward of two separate kinds of substances, that then we have this hard issue of how they interact, that's just intolerable. Maybe if we can't push forward on this and we do things like, we weigh a body after it dies, does it weigh any less? Oh, then the soul, must not weigh anything. People were taking the soul, spiritual substance, seriously for a long time before we reached this point where people like Ryle got fed up and said, is there a different way we can think of this? And this whole talk of a category mistake that, the mind is not a substance. When we use mental terms, we must be talking about something else. And as far as what we read, He doesn't actually go any farther than that. Now, you're right, Wes, that the view that he eventually takes is as a behaviorist, that what a mental state is a disposition, right? If you desire something, that's really, it's a disposition that you will get it if you want it. Of course, I use the word want.
Or if you say someone is vain, for instance, you're giving a series of hypotheticals. You're saying, well, if this happens, they're going to do this, they're going to boast under these conditions, blah, blah, blah. But I think Ryle's the one committing the category mistake here. Should I tell you why, or do we want to characterize his position more first? Or?
Let me say two things. So his eventual position on this is this dispositional account of desires and wants. And historically, that has not done well because it's really hard to say what the disposition exactly is without using other mental language, right? So if I want to say, what's a dispositional account of a desire?
Right.
Well, it's you go and get things, right? I'm trying to give you just observable behavior.
Right.
But it's not you always go and get things. You go and get things if you think that it is there to be gotten. Oh, I used the word think. No, I have to get.
Right.
Okay, well, how do we define think in dispositional terms? Like, then if I think it's there, then I'll go and get there, but only if I want it. So
yeah,
like,
and this is where we get to more contemporary versions of functionalism. They don't try and reduce everything to behavior. They want to say that you have to also be able to talk about other causes that are mental. So,
right. Just the definition, since you brought it up, of functionalism is to say how we define a mental state is that it functions in a certain way in relation to other mental states or behaviors or causes or whatever. So if you want to say, what's the definition of a desire? Well, it's a desire that interacts with beliefs in the way we were just talking about to produce certain actions. You could sort of lay things out like a flow chart, right? Which is why computer scientists really like functionalism. Like that's what most of them basically are, is if you want to say program a computer to understand a story, well, you have to say what background information does it have? How does it pull on that background information to answer questions about the story? So you just sort of put all these little pieces of information in different functional boxes. That grew out of Ryle's basic intuition, though. Let's think of some other way to talk about these things than focusing on our own conscious experiences, which seem really hard to analyze.
yeah.
The thing I did like about this is just this idea that maybe there's a different way to think of the mental. Maybe it's a different level of explanation. Specifically, I think the key insight of functionalism is, in fact, I just want to throw in Leibniz here for a second. In the Monadology that we read for another episode here, he described Leibniz's mill, right? So he described, you go into this building, you see all this stuff moving around, these big physical objects. You can't imagine how something like that, and you could think of the brain as being like that, as a lot of neurons or whatever pushing each other around, sending signals to each other. How could that produce the mental? It's his way of stating the mind-body problem.
And that's his Chinese room argument.
Yes. But maybe here's a way to think about it is, and it sort of introduces a different kind of dualism. It's not that the mental is a different kind of substance, but you could define the mental as something that pieces of matter do. Right, which we're familiar with all that, again, through this computer analogy, that you've got the physical pieces of a computer. Oh, how could pieces of data, how could it do anything? I'm just looking at little circuits here. But of course, it can run software. So you could think of the mind as like the software running on the hardware that's like the brain. So that has been at least a very helpful way historically for people to start thinking about the difference between mind and body, even though I know
it has its own problems.
Pieces of, it doesn't really address what consciousness is specifically, but it does address like how calculation could take place, which again was something that Descartes was worried about. Descartes thought that you had to have the soul to even account for like how we could calculate, how we could reason at all. Whereas a lot of what we might call reasoning, we think, maybe we could attribute that to computers or I don't know.
Yeah. Should I give my problem with Ryle thing now?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think the problem is he starts with this assumption that what dualists are doing is they're trying to make this distinction between intelligent and non-intelligent behavior, for instance. But they're really not just trying to give a description or make a distinction. They're trying to give a causal explanation. And they try and do that because they assume that no materialist account can be successful. So just to give you an analogy, suppose you were to say, well, for electricity, electrons are these ghosts. They're unobservable, and we know what the dispositions of objects like wires are, and we don't need these behind-the-scenes entities like electrons. Wires have specific observable properties and dispositions of their own, and that's all we need. So that's the analogous problem in science. If your goal were simply to give a logical analysis or a logical description of what's going on there, fine. But if you want an explanatory description, then you do get to these behind-the-scenes ghostly entities. So the goal of the dualist, if dualism is wrong, it's not because there is a category mistake or some logical mistake in description. It's because they have the wrong explanation. But it still counts as an attempt at an explanation. So again, dualism is not interested in giving a descriptive differentiation of intelligent from non-intelligent behavior. It's an explanatory causal hypothesis. It's not a category mistake.
Just to say what a category mistake is, so one of the examples that Ryle gives is the difference between a university and all the various buildings. So let's say I'm giving you a tour of the university. I show you all the various buildings, the Union and the Philosophy Building, and you say at the end, yes, but which building is the university? Then you have misunderstood what a university is, that it's the collection of all those things or something. And so similarly, maybe there's a better way to look at mind. Maybe it's somehow the collection, maybe it's something about the interaction, maybe it's an emergent property from something, but it's not just another thing in the world like the brain that has to then connect with the brain via the pineal gland or something like that, that there are other sorts of ways of explaining things that are perhaps better than that.
Yeah.
Which ultimately introduces this notion of multiple layers of explanation, which is something that, like thinking back to our Tractatus episode, Wittgenstein at that stage of his career had this, there are facts that are connections of basic things in the world. And if you want to talk about complexes, well, all you're doing is just talking about a bunch of those things together. And yeah, okay, maybe all the basic statements are about atoms or something, but if I'm talking about a complex like this book, what I'm talking about is just a collection of atoms. And ultimately, you should be able to reduce, even though you couldn't as a practical matter, any discussion of books to discussions of particular properties in physics or whatever. That if you have this idea that there's just a thoroughgoing metaphysical reduction possible of all things to some sort of basic things, and that all there is in the world, ultimately, your metaphysical position are these just binary basic facts, or to move away from Wittgenstein's position, individual atoms that are connected, right? Wittgenstein gave us the relation as being basic as opposed to the individual atoms. But both of these views seem incompatible with the idea that there could be real descriptions, say in biology or in psychology, that not just as a practical matter, but even theoretically just can't be reduced to more basic descriptions in physics or something.
Can I interject some naive comment here?
Please.
So, Wes, I thought what Ryle was saying was something along the lines of the thought process that gets you to the idea that mind is a substance. And you get into this, substance dualism, is that we understand the body to be a certain type of thing that's governed by a certain set of rules and laws and is bound by certain strictures like space-time and physical laws and so forth. And the problem was that we hypothesized something called mind, and we assumed that there were rules and processes and all that sort of thing that also governed it as well. And by virtue of doing that, by virtue of thinking that the mind works the same way as the body, you then assume that it must be a similar sort of thing. Even if it's a different thing, it's still a thing, kind of like the body. And what Ryle was basically just sort of introducing the idea that perhaps it's not that sort of thing because maybe it's not governed by the same sorts of processes.
But he's not just saying that it might not be that. He's saying it's logically incoherent for it to be that. It's a category mistake. And I'm saying it may be wrong, but it's certainly not a category mistake. Ryle wants to say mind can be, again, talked about in terms of the way a university can be talked about by talking about the organization of the parts of the university. And it's an abstract word, and it doesn't correspond to this physical thing. But what a dualist is trying to do is not simply tell you about the nature of the concept that's describing mind, or the concept that's, in the parallel case, describing the university. The dualist is trying to give a causal explanation of that phenomena, and the dispositions themselves aren't causes. So if I talk about, say, the concept of fragility as a series of dispositions to break, hypotheticals describing its disposition of a fragile thing like a plate to break under certain circumstances, I'm not giving a causal scientific explanation of what happens when a plate breaks. There's also a physical scientific causal explanation. So the same thing with the wire conducting electricity. You could say, yes, the wires are disposed to conduct electricity when their ends are connected to batteries and blah, blah, blah. But you do look to these reified, invisible, inferred electrons as a basis to explain that phenomenon. When we look to an electron, we don't ask ourselves whether it's a category mistake to reify this thing that we're using to explain it. We ask whether it's profitable. We ask whether it leads to predictions. We ask whether it's a model that works. So, again, substance dualism may be a mistake, but I think it would have to be a mistake in the same way that, say, a bad model of an atom would be a mistake. It's not its invisibility which speaks against it. It's just the fact that it's an explanation which either isn't useful or doesn't give you the right predictive results or so on and so forth.
I guess maybe I'm having trouble understanding sort of what you're taking issue with, because isn't that the point? I mean, he's trying to say, not only is it a terrible explanation that doesn't explain anything, because you're assuming that this thing you're calling a mind operates in this certain way, which means that you make the mistake of reifying it. Just to get back to that point, that you're saying that the mind must operate in a way similar to the body or similar to physical things, and so it must be a kind of thing, kind of like the body. So he's saying not only are you making that mistake, but also he's very critical that it's introduced this terrible issue in epistemology where you've separated the mind from the real world and created all of these challenges with having to have ideas conform to reality and all these other sorts of things. So it's sort of bad in two ways. Not only is it a bad explanation, but it also introduces a whole bunch of complications and difficulties that make it just of no use to us whatsoever.
Yeah, but to say something is a category mistake is not to say it's a bad explanation. It's to say that it's a mistake of logic. His criticism is not that it's a bad explanation per se in the sense that there are predictions that don't come out right or something like that. He's saying that you're mistaking university for an entity or something like that. Now, what he's ignoring is the fact that that's not really the motivation for dualism inventing mind. They're motivated by a problem which seems to make it apparent that there isn't a materialistic explanation for consciousness. If you didn't think that materialistic explanations failed, you would never go to the dualistic hypothesis.
The way I read Ryle actually might be a bit closer to what Seth is saying. When he says that the dualist makes a category mistake, it sounded to me like what he's trying to say is that the dualist thinks that the mind in some way is in the same category of thing as the body. And so, not exactly the same thing, but in the same category thing. And it kind of marries you to a certain list of things that follow from that. You know, there's causal relationships and so on in the mind. And yes, I agree that there's really two mistakes there. One, the one he calls the category mistake, and then the second thing that I read more of as a mistake made by people that didn't really want to give up the idea of religion, which comes from just having to postulate that this is completely different than the body. And I think then he also throws in a bit of the freedom of the will problem in there as well. And what's interesting to me about Ryle is also how he thinks that just by saying or by using two concepts in the same sentence, if you conjoin them in a sentence or if you disjoin them in a sentence, it already marries you to be saying something about them, somehow putting them in the same categories. Just saying that there are mental states and there are physical states, just by saying that, you're putting them in the same category. And since we already know quite a bit about physical states, then that forces you in some way to think that, okay, then some of the things that are true about physical states that we're very comfortable in talking about must be also true about mental states. And then, but they're not quite the same thing.
But the thing is, he has no argument against saying that the mind is like the body in that sense.
The argument is that it introduces problems.
That's his hypothesis about why mind as a substance was introduced. And his hypothesis is that there's a logical mistake where one thing is put into the wrong category because words are combined in certain sentences. But I think there's a much more plausible explanation for putting mind in that category, which is that someone is searching for an explanation of what they see to be a problem. Descartes has an argument for making mind like body, right? In the sense of being a substantial entity, spells it out. At least in the way Descartes describes it, it's not merely presented as some given, which is the result of a logical error. Anyway, that's all I'll say about that.
I've been struggling to try to get a hold of what Wes is really upset about here, and I think I finally got it. So I'm not going to elaborate. I just comment that I finally understand something that Wes was saying.
First time in the history of the podcast.
Ryle also does go a little bit into his behaviorist intuitions toward the end of this, where he seems to introduce, and he doesn't really develop this, so this is something that we maybe could talk about in terms of the Dennett article, but that he thinks it's a mistake to rest our understanding, right? If we see that the correct causal account of mental states is some invisible private entity, right? My soul that causes my states, then that maybe falsifies the way that we actually deal with each other, right? If you're going to say the cause of my mental states is this private invisible entity, then I think Ryle's saying if you were committed to that, you would be committed to saying, I only understand my mental states through introspection. I only understand what it is to believe, what it is to reason, what it is to talk rationally as opposed to irrationally because I observe this in myself. And he thinks that that's backwards. And I think this is an important intuition. I don't think Ryle expresses it, at least in this section, very well at all. But this is something that we're going to see in Dennett again, but also from Hegel and Nietzsche. And this is why I assumed, I guess, since I know you like those guys, Wes, that you might be more sympathetic to this in general. The fact that Descartes gives us this view that we have this certain knowledge about ourselves. And that's sort of the thing that we start with. That's the most certain thing in the world. Whereas developmentally, certainly that's not the way it works. We start by being very externally oriented, and it's only after people treat us in certain ways and say, reflect on what you did, think about what you did. Was that the right thing? And that we culturally get the idea of an inner life, of a conscience, of this turning inward. And it seems like Descartes' view commits you to misrepresenting how that whole dynamic works, and it gives you notions. For instance, like Hobbes's notion, that everybody is selfish, whereas Hegel's notion is we don't even know what the self is. We sort of we act more randomly. It's not that we're all born as these introspective people looking at what are my interests. Now I will go out and follow my interests, that we're all these individual egos that need to be protected from each other. No, in fact, what we are is this mostly outward-looking mass that, in fact, we could use a lot more introspection. That's why, philosophy would be good for us. So it's a larger political point.
Yeah. See, I think Descartes is doing a thought experiment, and he's not giving an account of empirical psychological development, and I don't think he prejudices you any way about the history of that development, and he's not saying people tend to be introspective in general, or I don't see that his argument relies on any account of empirical psychology.
You don't think that was it? I mean, that's one of the biggest movements in the history of philosophy that you had. And it's not just Descartes, it's Hume, it's Locke, it's all these guys that were sort of obsessed with the starting point, and really, because they're all working off of Descartes, of the inner life and trying to derive everything that there is about human beings from that. And it was a pretty major revolution. And yeah, behaviorism is a sort of dumb, harsh way of going about it, but there's something corrective and right about shifting things a little, that maybe we don't have certain knowledge of ourselves. Again, some of the extremes is that everything there is to understand about the human being is something that we could use more regular third-person scientific methods to get at. Whereas, even William James, who we were talking about, is, complete introspective psychologist, and these other phenomenologists following them. As much as I love phenomenology, I came out of grad school kind of skeptical that there's really a whole lot you can know about the world from sitting back in your armchair and introspectively exploring the structures of your experience and shit like that.
Yeah, I like introspection.
Who says phenomenology has to be about introspection?
I think with Descartes, the whole idea of certainty, I like to forget about the part after the introduction of God and all that stuff. I'm only interested in the first part of the thought experiment where
Sure.
I err, therefore I am. The illusion, we presume that it's illusory. And yet we still say that illusion is something to which we have access. So anyway, we're off on a tangent. But I just...
Right. But fundamentally, this whole conflict that you're definitely on one side or the other of, I don't care that much. I sort of go back and forth. I find both sides very interesting. But that Daniel Dennett's big book, Consciousness Explained, actually starts by describing that for Descartes to say that I'm being fooled by an evil demon or something is incoherent.
No,
it's not really worth going into
Dennett
that.
Is wrong. I think Dennett is completely wrong. And I also don't think he's describing Descartes at all.
He's describing a popular interpretation of Descartes that was very influential.
No, I think he admits in Consciousness Explained when he talks about the Cartesian theater that, not that I think anyone holds this view necessarily, and he doesn't talk about a single person who's advocated that straw man that he sets up as the Cartesian theater. His idea of the homunculus and all that stuff is itself a complete fallacy. No one's ever advocated the view of representation. Anyway, we're off on the consciousness explained now, which...
Well, that is a point. Before we get off of Ryle, that was the point that you objected to when I said we should read some Ryle here, which is what you would say is a mischaracterization of Descartes, this homunculus theory. Can you say a little about that? Because that's a pretty prevalent one in the literature that you had a problem with.
He presumes that the way theories of mental representation worked traditionally, the metaphor was an eye seeing an image, and that by talking about internal images, you were committed to talking about some little man inside your head who's then looking at those images, and then you get this regress.
Explain the regress.
The regress is then, you would have to explain the homunculus is looking at the image, again, in terms of another theory of an image in his head and with an observer, and so on and so forth, back ad infinitum. But, of course, no one would ever advocate that view. When people use the word mental image, they weren't using this very literally taken metaphor of an eye seeing an image. They didn't think that there was that relationship. They talked about immanence, right? So the image would be immanently present to or part of the mind, or you could even talk about it. I think many of those theories are compatible with functionalism on some level. And of course, today, functionalism and computational theory of mind are the representational theories. Anyway.
So we described Hume's view of sort of this associationist analysis of knowledge in great depth in another podcast. And it did seem like, we're saying, the only thing that we perceive are our own, that we have direct contact with are our own images, own perceptions, right? Some of them are copies of reality. Some of them are memories that we've, copies of reality that we stored for a while. But it sure seems like all the mental work is that we are comparing and analyzing these various images. They don't all have to be visual, but sensory images. And that's supposed to give us somehow an explanation of how perception works. But clearly, it doesn't explain how perception works because we're thinking, we've got the senses. They're giving us these images. But then how is it that we are looking at and associating these images? That's the thing that Ryle is pointing out. It seems like there's a major thing that's not explained still there. So if you thought that Hume, and fine, I'll rest it on Hume if you don't want me to pick on Descartes, but they have the same, exact analysis, and so does Locke and these other guys of what's going on here, that it's not a complete psychological theory. And maybe you could say that they weren't trying to do that anyway, but...
Yeah, I don't think they're doing psychology, really.
You guys didn't think, Seth, when we were going through the Hume, that he was trying to give, as best he could, a psychological account of what perception amounts to, with the faculties, comparing the things, and memory?
It's transcendental psychology. It's not empirical psychology.
Let Seth answer.
No, that is what I came away with. I mean, we struggled with this idea with whether or not he was just describing the way he thought the common person or the common people did things, or if he was actually providing some kind of philosophical or metaphysical account of the way things are. And then we had the same problem with James in the last episode.
Yep.
Hey, let's stop just for a second for a little break. If you could live forever, if you could cheat death with science and money, death would not be pleased. New from Neal Stephenson, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Reamde, Seven Eves, and Cryptonomicon, comes the wildly inventive and entertaining science fiction thriller Fall or Dodge in Hell. This is the story of a Richard Dodge Forthrast, a gaming company multi-billionaire who signed on what may have been the wrong dotted line and finds himself trapped in an unpredictable technological afterlife. Fall or Dodge in Hell is a grand drama of analog and digital, man and machine, angels and demons, the finite and the eternal. In this exhilarating epic, Neal Stephenson raises profound existential questions and touches on the revolutionary breakthroughs that are transforming our future. It's like Paradise Lost by way of Philip K. Dick. They say hell is other people, but it's also so much more. Want to live forever? Read Fall or Dodge in Hell by Neal Stephenson. Available now wherever wildly inventive books are sold.
This episode of The Partially Examined Life is brought to you by the St. John's College Graduate Institute. The Graduate Institute is the master's degree granting arm of St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Annapolis, Maryland. The Graduate Institute offers 3 distinct degrees: a Master of Arts in Liberal Arts offered on both campuses, a Master of Arts in Eastern Classics offered in Santa Fe, and a Liberal Arts Education Certificate offered in Annapolis. The Graduate Institute in both campuses have a summer term. Students can get their master's degrees in 4 summers or continue their studies in the fall and spring. Completing a degree in 4 summers is especially convenient for teachers and retirees. If time is a factor, the fastest way to complete a degree is to begin in summer and continue on for 4 semesters. You can have a degree in hand by August of the following year. Generous financial aid is available. The Graduate Institute is dedicated to the thoughtful reading of and serious conversation about the greatest books ever written and attracts a community who are passionate about the life of the mind. All classes at the St. John's College Graduate Institute are, like PEL episodes, discussions. The books are the teachers, and the faculty members are tutors who come together to learn as well. The Graduate Institute is currently accepting applications for the summer of 2019 and subsequent terms. Applications are accepted and decisions are made at any time on a rolling basis. There's no application fee, and the only requirement is a bachelor's degree in any field at all. If you are a PEL citizen, fan, or even a casual listener with an interest in joining other like-minded individuals in a more formal, intimate setting to engage in the serious contemplation of great works of literature, philosophy, history, theology, mathematics, and science, check out the St. John's College Graduate Institute. For more information, visit partiallyexaminedlife.com/SJCGI. That's partiallyexaminedlife.com/SJCGI.
All right, let's get back to the show.
So let's not dwell anymore on Ryle, but this traditional mind-body problem that comes from the introspective standpoint seems to result in difficulties that cannot be resolved through science or through any sort of analysis that I feel up to. So maybe we should look at intelligence in a different way, and that is Alan Turing's paper, Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence. And Turing is probably the star of our podcast this time. He's the person that I would think our listeners are more likely to have heard of due to the Turing test. I had never actually read any of him before this.
I had read a little.
Yeah, he's quoted a lot of this a little bit.
Yeah.
I think this might be the first time I've actually read his paper.
So Marco, do you want to give us your
Sure.
overview and take on what went on?
Yeah, sure. Actually, just going back to Ryle, just to introduce Turing, Ryle does actually say this. He says about Descartes, he says that he has mistaken the logic of his problem, and instead of asking by what criteria intelligent behavior is actually distinguished from non-intelligent behavior, he went on and asked a different question. So, in fact, that's what Turing is trying to do here, is actually trying to come up with a criteria for humans to actually figure out what intelligent behavior consists of. So he starts the paper by asking, very briefly, the question, can machines think? But then it abandons that question almost immediately because he thinks that in order to understand what the question means, we would have to ask what people normally think these words mean. What does machine think? What does think mean? It would just be mind-boggling to him to actually have to go down that route. So he says, well, let me change the question a bit into something that he thinks that he can approach a bit better. And he starts by describing what he calls the imitation game. And the imitation game is something that is played with a man and a woman and then a third party, which can be either a man or a woman, where the woman has to basically play herself. She has to try to convince the third party that she is in fact a woman, while the man is supposed to imitate the woman and try to make the third party believe that he is the woman. This is 1950, so there was no speech synthesizers or anything like that. The game itself is played by these three parties never really being in the same room. They're in separate rooms. They're talking to each other through some typewriter or what nowadays we would say maybe using a chat room. And so the game then gets changed a little bit. Now, imagine, he says, that the woman was replaced by a computer. And now the computer's job was to imitate the man, and the man was just to be himself. And so now the third party has to try to figure out which is the human and which is the computer. And if the third party can't do that or mistakes the computer for the human or vice versa, I guess, that's sort of a proof, I guess, that that particular computer can be considered intelligent. So if the third party says, okay, yes, I believe this particular contestant, I guess you could say, contestant A is actually the human, and it turns out that it's a computer, then this computer has passed a test for what it would mean to be intelligent. This is really an imitation game. The computer is not supposed to try to answer mathematical questions really fast or anything like that. It's really supposed to try to imitate being the man.
Right. So, but his central philosophical point here is if a machine can convince us it is human, what do you say, 75% of the time?
Right, something
like that. Then let's just call it intelligent.
Right. If you're exhibiting intelligent behavior, you're intelligent.
Right. Yeah. That's the only way we know that other people are intelligent is because we hear them say sensible things. If somebody consistently did not say sensible things to us, maybe we would think that they were insane or that had some brain issue. So why can't we then use the same criteria on machines? And this has probably been one of the most fruitful things in philosophy in terms of like contemporary science fiction and stuff. Machines that are doing nothing but symbol manipulation in the way that we think of computers doing it now, but yet should we consider R2-D2 a person? Should we consider the Cylons people?
That's right.
You've seen the new Battlestar Galactica, etc. And they make a lot of dramatic headway about this. Seth, what do you think?
What do I think about
the Turing test?
The Turing test. Fooling somebody into thinking that something is what it isn't is not the same thing as thinking that a thing, thinking that a thing is what it is.
So you don't buy it?
I don't. And I read quite a bit more about this specific thing, people trying to rationalize and make sense of it and so forth. But I have to say that I'm pretty convinced by the criticisms of the test as a criteria for calling something intelligent. And his prediction, that by the end of the century, essentially 50 years from now, we would have computers that do this. Not only has it not successfully been done, but that people are really uninterested in even trying. There's a contest out there and that there are still people that wrestle with this, but people understand that there are much more interesting and important things to be thinking about and doing. Signals how this got a lot of mileage in academia, but ultimately didn't have enough intellectual and cultural cachet to catch fire in kind of a wider audience.
Yeah, for the wider audience, there's much more of a practical view of artificial intelligence. Can it do something useful for me? I don't really care if it's intelligent in the same way that humans are. Just make it do something that's useful.
I don't know. I would call this interest in the sci-fi community the best that an idea like that can do in terms of spilling over into the regular culture and being thought-provoking and capturing people's imaginations. The Turing test itself, really, it passes a blind chat 75% of the time. That wouldn't be enough to convince me. But what if the robot can come into the room and maybe can fool me for months on end? I think it's a person. This is the premise of the new recently completed version of Battlestar Galactica. They're these very human-looking robots, and they're definitely robots, and they do crazy robot things occasionally, like somebody clicks on their programming, and they suddenly, have a different personality and shit like that. So they're not artificial, complete replicants. They're robots. But yet, if a robot can ask if it has a soul and seems to have introspection the same way that we do and seems to have and has dreams, wouldn't you at some point want to just say, okay, fine, for moral purposes, we'll treat you as sentient?
So let's distinguish at least three different things here. One is the kind of fascination that the sci-fi world that you're describing has with this concept versus the real world where people just are not expending a lot of time and energy trying to make this happen. So there's kind of like the practical that Marco mentioned versus our fascination with the idea that we can create life or that there's such a thing as artificial intelligence or artificial life. Then the second thing is whether or not it's a sufficient criteria for intelligence to say that making someone believe that making a human being specifically believe that you are another human being and you are not another human being is a sufficient criteria to say that you are intelligent. Whether that's just through a chat session or whether it's because we've created this elaborate cyber-skinned neural network-driven program thing. And then the third thing is, what is it that we actually consider intelligence or consciousness to be? And can we say that anything that's programmed meets or is the same thing as something that's conscious?
Right. So you get variations of these things like, oh, well, maybe it's not you've programmed every last response. Maybe you programmed some sort of basic learning code in it, and then it goes out into the world and has conversations and makes observations and builds up its own data store and things that it can talk about. And then people say, well, isn't that kind of the way people are? We come with built-in programming, right? Wes was talking about Chomsky's theory about linguistics and all these sort of internal directives and capacities that we have that if you were able to set up a self-improving machine like that, is it conscious, whatever, I don't know, but certainly you might want to call it intelligent. If it decides that we are the enemy and kills us all.
Mark, so you bring up what I consider to be the central point, which is self-learning or some sort of getting away from the idea of a programmatic thing, that intelligence and the way that human beings process information is not programmatic in the sense that we intake information or some sort of input, and then we apply a series of rules to it, and then we have output. That there's something different to what constitutes consciousness. So if you were going to set up a test to determine whether something was intelligent, at least in my mind, it would have to be something that could create new rules, that wasn't bound by the restrictions of its own rule application.
Yeah, I think even if you presumed it could do all of that, give it the souped-up computational abilities possible, there's the question of the extent to which computation is what's going on in the brain. And pairing this with Ryle, this is sort of the minimal functionalist criterion for consciousness, right? You're looking at behaviors and drawing your conclusions from that. But you might want to say, well, is there something about the neurochemical properties of a brain that has something to do with consciousness? As we'll see, Searle thinks that that's involved. Is neural networking required? Is something beyond computation required? Something subatomic? So I'd be more convinced if you showed me a brain in a vat and showed me it was doing all the same things as a regular brain. I would be more convinced that was exhibiting consciousness than I would that something that was exhibiting behaviors. Behaviors are not that reliable, and we have other means to... We might say, okay, the requirement of consciousness is to have these specific modules in the brain doing these specific things and having these relations. I don't think we could ever be fully confident unless you replicated the brain exactly.
Now, your talk of the disembodied brain and how you might believe it's conscious brings to mind another philosophical classic, one of my favorite movies when I was younger, Steve Martin's The Man with Two Brains, where he walks around with a disembodied brain and that can communicate with him through telepathy and falls in love with it, and his evil scheming wife puts it in the oven at some point. And yeah, at least at the point in 1950 when Turing is writing this, he feels the need to counter the ESP objection. Oh, if all real minds could exhibit ESP, maybe that would be different. You wouldn't think that the computer program could have ESP. So
yeah, that is the weirdest one.
Yeah,
the argument from extrasensory perception.
But at the same time, I'm not sure that Turing really was trying to figure out. I mean, I'm not sure whether he equaled intelligent with consciousness. I'm not sure that he would have believed necessarily that a machine that passes this test is actually conscious. And I don't know if he really cared at this point. I think it was much more of a practical test for him. It was, this machine is intelligent, and that's about all I can say about it. And consciousness is sort of a mysterious thing, and I'm not going to cover it in this paper. That's what I kind of got out of his reply to the consciousness argument.
So what was the point of bringing it up? Why did he spawn 30 years of discussion about this?
That's a good
really,
question.
it's the Chinese room response which got all the discussion.
Should we just make the jump?
Sure. I was just going to say, Steven Pinker, apparently there was so much discussion of Searle's Chinese room argument on all the philosophy lists that he had to unsubscribe to every philosophy list, I guess, during the 90s or something, or whenever it was. Maybe it was earlier. It's all everyone talked about. So anyway.
So John Searle is a contemporary philosopher of mind, and I have actually his book from 2004, Mind, A Brief Introduction, which I recommend. I think it has a really good overview of the various positions at the beginning.
Yeah, I read that.
And I was very surprised. I'm pretty surprised at sort of what his ultimate solution to the mind-body problem. It's not anything I would have predicted just by looking at this Chinese room argument. But what he's most famous for is this thing from 1980, the Chinese room argument, and in fact, there's a separate article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on it that is so freaking long.
I read that too. I like that.
Yes. I don't think we should even attempt to be at all thorough in sort of the responses that are available to this thing. Just we'll refer people to that article.
We should talk about semantics and syntax. That's the one thing.
Sure. Let's say what it is. Who wants to... Marco or Seth, people that have not talked as much as me and Wes?
Sure, I can take it if you want.
Go ahead, Marco.
So he imagines this thought experiment where Searle is locked into a room, and he says he doesn't speak a word of Chinese, he doesn't read it, but he has a book, it's in English, and it explains how to take certain symbols that come through the door, how to take the symbols, look them up in the book, and then figure out what other symbols he has to pass back out of the room. Okay, so these symbols keep coming in, he looks them up in the book, returns them, it figures out what else he has to put together, other symbols that he has in this bunch of bins, I guess, and then he just passes them back out of the room. And unbeknownst to him, the symbols, the strings of symbols that are coming into the room are called questions. And the symbols that are going back out, that is pushing back out, are called answers to these questions. And so his point is here that to the outside, it would look like there's a native speaker of Chinese inside the room with which you're having a conversation. But his point, though, is that he, in fact, has no understanding of what is going on. He doesn't understand Chinese, he still doesn't understand Chinese, and he'll never understand Chinese for as long as he's in this room just doing this symbol manipulation. And I think his point here is that this specific type of computer, because he's not saying that machines can think, he's not saying that computers can think, he's saying this specific type of computers described as symbol manipulation machines.
Which is more or less what Turing was talking about, right?
Yes, exactly.
He's saying something to pass the Turing test and still...
Yes, he's actually passing the Turing test for a Chinese speaker, and yet there is no knowledge of Chinese in Searle or the person locked into this room. He's following rules of syntax. He's manipulating symbols, but the symbols have no meaning. There's no semantics, and he thinks this is an argument that it's pretty decisive because he also believes that the semantics cannot arise out of syntax.
Explain that a little bit.
I wish I could.
So semantic is what the term actually means.
Right, exactly. That's what computers are doing.
So for a language, the syntax is the grammar. It tells you what ways you can combine things that will be meaningful, but there's no assignments necessarily of words to objects. Like the assignment of dog to dog is semantics. You got to give the symbols meaning that way, as opposed to saying that the dog is running is a well-formed, grammatical, syntactically correct way of organizing those words. Right.
The symbols aren't about anything when you're doing syntax, but when you're doing semantics, they actually are about a particular thing. So the symbol DOG actually stands for your concept of a dog, a physical dog.
And the analogy in computers is that there are series of charged and uncharged, I guess, transistors, and there's syntactical operations, there's inputs, and those are manipulated, and then there's outputs. And that's all like a physically instantiated syntax. But there's nothing that says, this set of charges corresponds to me gunning someone down on Call of Duty. If you rig things up a different way, it might be me playing the Hello Kitty game or something like that. Human beings have to be there to give something semantics. It's not inherent in the system, let's say.
And there are many, many responses to this. And I'm amazed how many smart people come down on both sides of this and give different responses, which to me says that there's something wrong with the thought experiment. But
yeah, I think whether there are things wrong with it, but it's incredibly important to modern functionalism and how it was refined.
Two things. One is it's very poorly named because there's nothing Chinese about the room.
That's good.
But it has pictures of Mao up in it, doesn't it?
It's decorated.
Actually, that's the best objection I've ever heard.
But I think it does do a pretty good job of telling a story that gets to what, at least for some of us, is just kind of a gut level objection to the issue. That just by virtue of performing actions according to a set of prescribed rules doesn't correspond to what we think of as understanding or intelligence. And I think it does a good job of demonstrating that.
And it seems to be a challenge to functionalism because you're still doing these inputs and outputs and it's performing the required function, and yet it seems to be counterintuitive to our conception of consciousness. But one of the objections is, the brain is just a electrochemical thing itself, and it's counterintuitive that its processes could give a rise to consciousness. It doesn't matter if the guy in the room understands Chinese. It's the organization and activity of the whole room which would understand Chinese, or which could said to be conscious, maybe.
The systems reply.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's get back to the key point, too, which is it's not so much about what's happening in the room. It's about the perception of what's happening in the room from the outside. This is a direct response to the idea, just to bring it back to Turing's point, that if you're inputting questions into the chat and you're getting back responses that make you think that the person responding is actually a person and not a computer, then somehow that's no different than if the person responding is actually a person and not a computer that's been programmed. And that Searle is getting at something pretty deep here, with just this sense that we have that somehow response is not enough. We want to say there's more than just being able to mimic human responses to be able to, for us to accord you the status of being conscious or intelligent.
I think it even goes beyond that, though, because it's also that syntax is not enough. It's more than behaviors. We've gone beyond behaviors to the actual syntax itself, to those activities of processing inputs and giving outputs. And in a way, this is another way of reframing the mind-body problem without talking about mind and body explicitly. You could call it semantic indeterminacy. You could rephrase the mind-body problem. Well, how is it that syntax gives a rise to semantics? That's baffling.
Let me first say, so the Churchland book that I was reading, he's a materialist, and he thinks you can give the same thought, like my pencil is on the chair or whatever, in a bunch of different instantiations. You can put it in different languages. So the thought is independent from the medium in which it is embedded. And in the same way, you could create a symbol system to represent it, to capture the meaning inside any physical system. That's what really writing is. In a sense, any symbol has semantics. Unless you've just constructed a formal logic and it doesn't have a semantics defined. But if you actually create a symbol that stands for something, well, then it has a meaning. Now, Searle is going to jump in and point out, well, it only has a meaning in your head. It's not in the symbol itself.
Right.
It has to have an interpreter, right? So there's a guy, Zoltan Torrey, that I was looking at it. He has this view that all animals, pretty much anything with a brain, create a representation of the environment around them, which he calls awareness. Now, that's not the same as consciousness. It just means that you are able to globally react to a sort of global representation of your environment. And then he thinks that you can explain all animal reactions with this. On top of that, he says people have a very distinct part of the brain that's sort of connected by this offline, and it's very much connected to the linguistic centers that can then reflect upon the first level awareness. So these are just called higher order theories of consciousness. And the idea is that even if the initial representation is just syntax and is just mechanical triggering, it could be very flexible mechanical triggering, right? So the animal can pursue different ways of achieving its goal or whatever, but it really doesn't have an inner life the way we think of it until self-consciousness comes in. And that's where semantics, as Searle would have it, gets introduced. You can encode letters in the brain or any kind of symbols in the brain, and as long as there's some other part of the brain that's reading the symbols, then there you go. There's your semantics out of syntax.
I don't think it's that simple, though.
Well, of course it's not that simple, but this is the vague outline that I've read theory after theory that sort of followed this in general.
No, I'm not. I don't think that works. See, I think Searle here is not on the right track. I think the concept today that's more dominant with Jerry Fodor and others, the functionalist idea is that, it's still semantics arising out of syntax, but they want to say that the semantics are determined by the aspects of their functional role that external causes interacting with the brain and so on and so forth. There's a bunch of theories about it. The basic idea is that semantics arises from syntax in some way, but I think it's still baffling. To say that one, like a higher order theory where one bit of syntax, or even you could talk about as many layers as you want, it's still a brain with electrical signals running through it, and it's hard to see how you get meaning out of that.
Just relating this back to the Chinese room argument, so some people responding to that say, oh, well, if you had perception in, kind of like I was saying, let the robot out in the world to learn by itself. If it wasn't just you locked in the room, if this symbol comes in and you have a little window and you see out, oh, every time this symbol comes in, I'm looking at grass. So maybe this symbol refers to grass or is green or something like that, then that's how you would get meaning in. Now,
because grass isn't coming in, symbols are coming. Electrochemical signals are coming in, not grass.
Yes, right. That's Searle's response. Is that, well, that's just more syntax. That doesn't respond. That doesn't help at all. Pretty much the response is that, okay, the way you've described the Chinese room, yes, that's not conscious. But if you built it up in some other crazier way, then it might be conscious, or it would be conscious. And the fact that you're saying it's not is really just getting at your pre-philosophical intuition that something like this can't be conscious, which is begging the question. One of Searle's responses is the response to the systems reply, right? It doesn't matter that you, as the person manipulating the symbols, don't understand because you're just like a piece of the brain. Of course, a piece of the brain is not conscious or does not understand. It's the whole. It's the brain as a whole. It's the system as a whole. Well, he says, let's internalize the whole system. So instead of reading a book, I just remember the book. I memorize the book, and that's where it really starts to break apart for me. I just don't think that even theoretically something like that could pass the Turing test. If you really had something a system that could respond as rapidly as a person, that had the whole thing internalized, that had the perception angle, that had the mobility, whatever, you'd be much more, I think your intuition would be much more shaky about that. Yeah, I'm just repeating what I said earlier. If you had a real robot running around, it would be harder to deny them their claim of sentience.
Especially if the robot's hot.
Yeah. Like six. By the way, Battlestar Galactica was one of the, not just science fiction wise, it was one of the best television shows that was ever made. I'm just going to put that out there.
I agree.
I got to download that legally.
One of the things that's kind of troubling to me, Mark, about what you're saying is that essentially what you're saying is, you know what, if we could build a robot that was just like a human being, then it would be a lot harder for us to say that it wasn't a human being. And part of what's implied, and I think Searle says this at one point, if not, it might have been in the Nagel article, but at this point, I'm not sure which it was. It says the whole idea that you can create something that would essentially, that mimics the mind. Artificial intelligence is not about being an artificial brain. It's about being an artificial mind. And so whether you do it with neural nets or a biological machine or a discrete state computer, in theory, the idea is there's something about consciousness or mind that we can duplicate, and that if we can duplicate it and it can stand this Turing test, then somehow we have to attribute intelligence to it. And that's a way to sneak in this substance view of mind, because it's basically saying mind is independent of brain, and you can mimic mind with something other than human brain. And part of what I think it's Searle is saying, says, no, the biological thing that is our brain plus all the other stuff combined is what makes us who we are, and that's what consciousness is. And there's a lot of things you can do, and remember, he's not arguing against what he calls weak AI, he's arguing against what he calls strong AI, but the bottom line is you're still trying to imitate what we consider to be consciousness, and the only way to do that would be to have something that can store memories, grow up, have sense experience, be in a body, be a social creature, blah, 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 sleep, eat, all those other sorts of things, which is to say just be human. And so it's kind of the whole enterprise is just kind of silly. If you want artificial intelligence, have a kid.
Yeah, that's great.
And dress it like a robot.
Great. That's the most convenient way to get artificial intelligence. So for Searle, right, one of Searle's arguments is that, well, it's the medium does count. You can't just instantiate it with someone in a room or instantiate it. There's a Chinese nation argument where you have everyone in China fulfill the roles of neurons and act just like neurons, and then the functionalist conclusion would have to be, well, that's a sentient being now. The nation itself will create a sentient being. So I think Searle finds that counterintuitive. He wants to say, well, no, there's a specific kind of matter with these biological properties that this must be instantiated in. I'm not so quite sure that I see that. I think whatever the materials involved, silicon or whatever, and I don't think we have to use the Turing test. I think if we use a more fine-grained test that says, okay, are all these very fine-grained brain functions being performed, and do they have the associated relationships to output and input, then I think you could say with some confidence that this is a conscious being. Even though in the back of your mind you might wonder, well, if it doesn't involve brain meat rather than silicon, maybe it's not conscious. That might be like a nagging thing. I think the whole developmental thing is very important, growing up and being in a body, but the problem for me is that at the sort of periphery of our brain, all we have are these electrical inputs. And we could mimic having a body. We could put a brain in that and let it marinate for 18 years on the matrix inputs of just the right electrical signals that would give it, all the experience of growing up and having all those learning experiences and blah, 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 and having a body and blah, blah, blah. That seems possible to me.
It does, but I don't know if that really goes much beyond that argument, because after all, that brain is your body, right? So you still have the same problem. You just got rid of the body and you still have the inputs. But what is it that's special about the way the brain is made that gives rise to consciousness? Can we not imagine another being, maybe from another planet, that is made of something different, but is still conscious? I think that's kind of to me at least, it seems intuitive that could be possible.
Yeah, I agree.
Right.
Right. That was supposed to be the advantage of functionalism identity theory or something, which we haven't talked about yet. But identity theory just meaning my pain is identical in some way with a brain state, a particular brain state. And type identity theory specifically say, every time there's a pain, it's because there's some particular part of my brain that's doing whatever, and that's what a pain is. Whereas a functionalist might say that somebody that doesn't have that kind of brain could still have pain. It's just whatever makes the thing go, and jump around and run away from the thing that's hurting it. Like, that's what we would consider pain. So why don't we call that pain, even if they don't? So that opens the door that maybe a computer could feel pain if it can have the appropriate. It doesn't necessarily have to just be behavior. Maybe there's an inner thing that it has to have too, but it opens a question there that maybe there's a token identity between the pain and the substance that is underlying it. So it's not like pain is a free floating thing in a mental state. It is in me. It actually is this brain, but that doesn't mean this, particular part of my brain freaking out. But that doesn't mean that in somebody else, some other kind of being, it couldn't be something different, which seems reasonable enough. But the functionalism,
functionalism incorporates some of identity theory, but
right. Yeah, it's a type. It's a token identity theory, like I was saying. Functionalism is at least compatible with that, right? So functionalism is really just a strategy for analyzing, how people's mental states. It's a way of introducing an explanatory dualism that maybe we can talk about psychology without talking about brain science all the time. That maybe we can do something useful with that. And I think highlighting that distinction that one of you brought up that Searle makes between weak AI and strong AI is worth clarifying. That is, if you believe in weak AI, you believe we're making computer programs to help us understand how people think. We're doing a simulation of how people think, but it seems reasonable. And Searle wants to say that's totally different than this. This is functionalism light.
By the way,
actually saying it literally produces a mental state.
Just to say one thing, even if we by some form of functionalism. There are different types, obviously, and it's compatible with dualism. And we can't pretend it's a solution to the mind-body problem. Yes, I believe that if you could create something which does enough of what the brain does, that you would be creating consciousness. But that doesn't mean that it's still not baffling to me how the physical gives rise to the mental, or how syntax leads to semantics, and so on.
No, that's a good transition to Nagel.
Okay.
Who wants to talk about Nagel? Wes, he's your favorite person, right?
I think, yeah, he's one of my favorites. He's not one of these people who thinks that, in principle, the mind-body problem is insoluble. I lean towards thinking it's not solvable in principle. But Nagel has some interesting ideas how it might be solved. But I guess the basic thing to get out of this reading that we have today is that he wants to focus on this idea that consciousness involves what it's like to be something, and that we can't know that objectively. And you can take the example of a bat, which we presume has conscious experience, and because it has sonar and echolocation, it has the types of conscious experiences we would never be able to be ourselves be able to have. And we can objectively study that animal and study its brain, but we'll never know what it's like to be a bat. So objectivity involves access of a number of subjects and their agreement concerning these public phenomena that we all have access to. But the bat's sensations, the bat's experience, and what it's like to be a bat are not among those public external objects. We can't look inside a brain and see the sensation or have the sensation just by virtue of doing that. And so when we do say neuroscience or empirical psychology, and we say, oh, well, this brain state corresponds to fear, the amygdala is lighting up, so this person is afraid. We would never be able to derive that from the lighting up of the amygdala by itself. We need the person's report, or, perhaps it's possible to observe their behavior, but we need some public observable thing happen. And then the second step we need is we need to have experienced fear ourselves.
I thought it was pretty compelling, too.
Yeah.
So now, how do we know, and to what extent does it matter that there really is a qualitative state? What is it like to be a bat? Right, on that analysis that I attributed to Zoltan Torey, that all animals have. He just has a funny name.
Is this real? I think he just made this up. This doesn't exist.
The other thing about this dude is that he's blind. So he wrote a whole book on consciousness without being stuck to the sort of visual metaphors that, like, he's been blind for 50 years. So That in itself was pretty interesting. So his analysis, which I don't think is unique. I think this
is he blind? Is he blind as a bat?
Theories like this.
Sorry,
we'll never know. Is that animals have this awareness, but they don't have consciousness in anything that we would talk about. And I think there's something to this idea that when we think of consciousness ourselves, we muddle together our being aware of something, our something having qualitative a feel to us, our ability to reflect on our own experience. Like, we can't pull these apart. And so for us to make any conclusions about what it's like for these other animals, or that it is like anything to be them, maybe Descartes is right in it. It's all automated
God.
Or what,
I cannot
I'm just
believe
saying
I'm
this.
hearing
How
this.
do we,
Your dog, there's nothing what it's like to be Stubby. There's nothing what it's like to be Stubby.
The reason that we say otherwise is because of the similarity that those animals have in the way that they react to us. In other words,
that's why we say it about other people, though. We have the same lack of access to other people. It's just the other
Mark,
mind's
are you
problem.
Are you trying to turn Nagel's article into that, or are you saying this is what this other mythical character that you read has to say?
I'm trying to say that there's a fundamental assumption in the Nagel article that there is something that it is like this subjectivity. I want to say that these are distinct phenomena. Subjectivity, what we might call consciousness, which is, I don't know, that consciousness is exactly the problematic term, but what you could call unreflected but globally awareness, that is the chance to give us a flexible ability to globally react to our environment. Those are not necessarily the same thing.
He's not saying they have they have a reflective self-consciousness. He's just saying that there's something that it's like to be them. Let's stick with that phrase. I mean,
yeah, he's what he's saying is this subjective experience of being X, whatever X is different than the objective description of being X. It's a piece of knowledge that you don't get if you take something and you dissect its brain, or that you put a brain scanner on and you figure out what's happening when it's subjected to fear or when it's hungry, and you're reading all these brain states. That's a piece of knowledge. That's information you get, but it is not the same as the subjective experience of the thing that is having it. What he's trying to make the point with the bat is he's trying to say the experience of whatever it is to be a bat is not something that we can even approach through our imagination or through thought experiments or whatever, which is the way that we typically approach things like subjective experience. So when you're wondering what's going on in somebody else's mind, another human being, you can imagine what it's like to be in their place. And because you have the same sensory apparatus and maybe a similar background or whatever, you can more or less successfully approximate their experience. And what he's saying in the case of the bat is you don't have any way of coming close to understanding what it is like to have that bat's subjective experience. That's just a piece of knowledge that's
right.
That's
hidden
hidden
to
us.
That's a good description of what he's saying. It's troublesome to me that, because I think, again, that has to be conditional. If there is a subjective life, if there is a point of view within a bat, we could not know it. Sure, I have no problem with that. But how do we know that there is?
This is just a basic intuition. I mean, if you disagree that there's...
What about a roach?
But that's why we stick to, take your dog, for instance.
Yeah, it does say that it doesn't have to be an exotic creature or anything that's strange. You could make the same argument just with a blind person. Unless, of course, they go through some kind of operation, they would not be able to know what it means to be able to see things, colors, and objects.
There's a famous argument, I think he refers to it, right? The knowledge argument. It's a short article by Frank Jackson, and it comes up in the literature a lot, but it postulates this colorblind scientist who knows everything about the theory of color. There actually is a real scientist, by the way, who's colorblind, who's like a foremost expert in theory of color. But anyway, the idea of this thought experiment is that if they did get that operation and they, for the first time, experienced red, that would add something to their knowledge. They may have known everything theoretically about red and the way what brain states produce that and blah, 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 but they would never have had that subjective experience, which they also call qualia, or just that, what it's like to be at its most fundamental level, that what it's like to have an experience of red, that's some new knowledge that scientist gains once she's no longer colorblind. So it's a similar sort of argument. I mean, I think we have to intuitively First of all, we can't know, right, for sure whether other people are conscious. That's just the more general other minds problem. Because, again, we can't objectively verify that either. We have to read behaviors and infer consciousness. And so when we do that with a dog or a bat, we have enough overlap behaviorally to infer some sort of subjectivity. But we don't have enough overlap. We don't have the complete kind of overlap to say that I can make all the required empathetic ascriptions. So that's the key. The key is that the two circles are not completely apart and that they don't completely overlap, that we have something which there's enough overlap to be able to make some empathetic ascriptions, to know that in some ways we do know what it's like to be a bat, but in critical ways we don't.
Right.
And that just highlights the fact that when other people use words like fear and so on and so forth, it involves that step of empathetic ascription where we say, yeah, I know what it's like to fear. But when someone says something's round, it's not like I have to say, oh yeah, I know what it's like to be round in order to understand what you just said.
Right, and the Jackson article is an argument against physicalism, while I guess Nagel doesn't go as far as saying that physicalism is false, but just that there's something else we need to know. There's something quite mysterious about this, that there's a way in which we haven't approached a more basic question, which is there any way in which these subjective experiences can be seen as objective?
Right. Nagel thinks that there might be some interesting ways that we might be able to, get to that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
These are arguments, just to relate this to what we were talking about before about identity theory, these are arguments against reductive identity theories, which is really, Ryle is a reductionist, right? He thought mental talk is all kind of pre-scientific garbage, and we should just talk about behaviors. We should talk about observable things. So you could do the same as an identity theorist or as a physicalist, which is to say that a complete scientific description of the world would only, again, talk about basic particles. And if you're talking about any higher levels of description, well, it's just shorthand for talking about the basic particles just because it's inconvenient to account for every atom. But really, ultimately, in theory, you should be able to reduce everything, all this complicated talk, to that basic talk. So both Jackson and Nagel are giving just, hey, look, here, you know all the physical stuff about it, but there's still this thing about subjectivity, about what it's like to see red or whatever that you still don't know.
Yeah.
So Searle, for instance, is a non-reductive physicalist, I would say. He just says, this is from his Mind, A Brief Introduction, the view that he eventually comes to, which is that I'm not going to deny, he says, yeah, the first person point of view is ontologically first person. And I don't know what the hell he really means by pulling in ontologically there, but still, it's identical with the brain state that's underlying it. But you shouldn't see this as a reductive physicalism. He just thinks all these categories of physicalism and dualism are all just misleading, and you should just, it's really very basic. It's just, look, the mental state is the physical state described at a different level. The underlying physical properties cause the surface level mental properties, which is just, how these underlying things phenomenally appear to us, just like lightning is really electric charges, but it appears to us in this way. Well, it's the same when we're looking at our own consciousness. So yes, there's an irreducible point of view. He's going to say Nagel is right, but that doesn't really stop us from doing science in the way that the identity theorists want to.
That the identity theorists want us to stop doing science?
Nagel seems to imply, well, he says it in this article that, look, if we could develop a sort of a more objective understanding of what mental states are, but we don't have to talk about the brain at all.
Yeah, right.
So he's called by other folks a Mysterian about, it's just, it's fundamentally mysterious how these mental properties could connect to physical properties. That's not actually the way that he plays out in his The View from Nowhere. I was pleasantly surprised to see that he comes to a dual aspect theory,
right,
which is essentially sounds a hell of a lot like Searle's. And he ends up doing a lot of the same work.
Look, if your puzzlement over the mind-body problem is relieved by these theories, then fine. That's an intuitive thing, but these don't make me feel any less puzzled about how the physical gives rise to the mental. And we can speculate about, science must be able to solve the problem ultimately, but there are, in principle, I think what Nagel's pointing to, even though he doesn't ultimately think it's a slam dunk, but there could be, in principle, problems with the idea that science has anything to say to solve the mind-body problem. And that's the direction towards which I lean. And I think it's not clear a priori that the domain of science extends to every realm of inquiry, that the domain of science necessarily must solve everything that puzzles us. There are some things which may simply be insoluble. Now, of course, I'm interested in neuroscience. I'm interested in what it says about these problems. In a way, it gives more detail to the problem, but I don't see any of these things, as interesting as they are, as getting rid of that fundamental aporia.
Can I just draw a point of comparison? So we talked about Hume's analysis of causality, that there's something mysterious about this power of, something having a power to bring something else about. Like, it's just not something, this inner power isn't something that appears to us in our perception, and we can't understand, if you sort of just look at the perceptions itself, how we could even get this idea other than just, they're just constant conjunction. So there's something fundamentally mysterious about causality. That doesn't stop scientists for even a second from they just say, okay, maybe they'll recognize Hume's point.
Yeah, but that's not the mind-body problem is a more restrictive problem, right? It's the special problem. It's not Hume's problem.
I'm not saying it's Hume's problem. I'm saying the way that a scientist might see Hume's view of causality is very much the way Searle, for instance, sees this fundamental, yes, there is something mysterious about the way things look different from a first-person point of view than they do from, backing off and looking at them from a third-person point of view. And that's just a basic epistemological feature of our experience and something we have to deal with when we do science. And we can work around that and still discover a lot of stuff that can satisfy our
no one's saying we
can't
make neuroscientific discoveries. The question is whether the mind-body problem is one day going to go away because we've done a lot of neuroscience. And I think there are fundamental problems about talking about the relationships between physical things and their structure and their dynamics, and the counterintuitive sense in which we can say that we can relate that scientifically, again, to this what it's like to be. I'm not sure how we get around that difference in, let's say, categories and types. And it's to talk about the way an electron is related to a nucleus is always going to be something very different than to talk about how brain activity is related to consciousness. And I think it's very
comparable to how the mechanical description of the lightning and then how the lightning appears to us. I mean, that is the same problem. That is a version of the mind-body problem, right? Phenomenal properties versus their underlying mechanical properties.
I don't think it's quite the same problem because you can derive certain higher level qualities, certain epiphenomenal qualities, say of water, let's say it's liquidity, from the underlying states. There are some things you can derive, yeah. But I still think the being for
but aren't there a lot of things about our qualia that you can potentially derive from the physical analysis of it too? You can't derive the whole thing. You can't derive the fundamental subjectivity of it.
There's nothing you can derive unless you receive a report and then have had that experience and empathetically give meaning to that report. There's nothing you could derive per se from the brain itself. If you had never had those experiences, you could never, look at a brain state for experiencing red and simply derive it a priori. Someone would have to tell you they're seeing red while that brain state is activated. No?
Well, liquidity, as you were describing it, is not a phenomenal property.
Well,
right? There's always going to be the way liquidity appears to me, right? Every single physical thing that we could possibly have interactions with is going to have a phenomenal correlate. And I think there's a lot intelligent we can say about how these things hook together, but there's always going to be some fundamental mystery about subjectivity itself.
Yeah, I agree.
So it would be interesting to read more as a group of that Nagel book as a way of countering pragmatism, right? Because Nagel's big thing is pragmatism and verificationism. These are all tools to simplify, to cop out on philosophical problems. And this is
yeah, motherfucker.
This is the West view.
Fuck yeah.
But yet we all, at least the three of us that were not West, and even West sometimes, seem very sympathetic to the pragmatic approach. And incidentally, the next podcast that you folks will hear after this one is more discussion of pragmatism with Dylan Casey back with us. You could say, I don't care what uses things have, as Wes had said in analysis. I just want to understand but there's still a question of sort of how much time does anybody want to spend on any given one of these problems? And somebody like...
I'm going to destroy pragmatism in the next episode.
And there are plenty of folks who say, okay, I'm going to work on the problems that seem like they can admit of a solution. And that's going to be enlightening and interesting to me.
Then why are you studying philosophy?
Because there are many philosophical problems that are like that.
Anyway, there's a lot about mind. I'll just repeat the point that I made at the very beginning of this. We used to think in Descartes' time that anything involving reasoning was just inexplicable. We cannot imagine how matter could be involved in shifting information around, in doing syntactical things like that. But yet now that's much clearer. It doesn't solve the whole mind-body problem, but it's made some progress. You disagree?
I mean,
it shifted the field of discussion.
Descartes thought of the brain, knew there was a brain, then it was a mechanical system. You're right, but I think these are finer grain understandings of the problem. I don't think that they're things which decrease my fundamental puzzlement. So
right, we're not closer to the answer. I don't think we're just closer to understanding what the problem is.
Yeah,
if there is, of course, a problem.
And it's some of this is a matter of temperament, Mark, as you were saying.
Yes.
Well, it's funny that we use the word problem because it does seem that part of what's happened is like tonight, even as we've been discussing it, at points you're kind of like, are you even denying that? Like asking the question, could you even deny that? And then is it the language that's causing a problem? Maybe, the very first question I feel like we have to ask ourselves is, do you or do you not believe that you have some kind of unified experience of self that somehow, I don't have the right language to even to say what it means. It's real to you, that differentiates you from other people, that whether or not you actually believe and experience that you have a unified self and things like thoughts and that sort of thing. And if you believe that you do, then it's a thorny problem to try to understand how it is that you have that and how it all ties into your brain. And if you don't feel that way, then you have got to figure out a way to explain to the rest of us to do that you don't.
See, I think this is another straw man. I think that maybe Ryle was one of these people. In fact, even the behaviorists were, for the most part, methodological behaviorists. They just thought, okay, maybe there are these qualia, private mental states or whatever, but that's not anything that we can deal with. So let's, as scientists, not approach things that way. They might even admit, if you press them, well, is your science addressing everything that could possibly be known? Well, no, but we're doing our job. We're freaking scientists. Come on, be serious.
Dennett wrote a book called Consciousness Explained. Well, and then it dismisses the idea of qualia. I think Dennett doesn't believe there is such a thing as consciousness.
No. So Dennett comes forward as somebody who admits Nagel's basic point. Yes, there is a fundamental subjectivity. There is something that is like to be me, but denies Frank Jackson's argument, which is that you can capture these things, you can call these things facts. So he shares this with the Churchland book that I read. I think this is a good way of getting into it, that Churchland says the color scientist who has never actually seen red, if that person finally sees red, you wouldn't call what's been added a new fact. Maybe they have a new pre-linguistic point of comparison to add to their way of perceiving the world, a new way of knowing things, but they haven't added a fact. So he wants to distinguish between ways of knowing things and things that can be known.
This reflects a desperation to say that science is going to explain everything. It's a desperate argument that makes no sense. How does that argument make sense? There's nothing new added to the colorblind scientist's knowledge when they see red.
It doesn't.
I don't think anyone's committed. This is Dennett's
fact.
Characterization. Frank Jackson didn't say it was a fact. He said it was something.
You have all the physical facts, but yet there are facts that are left over, and these are the mental facts. And this is what Dennett.
Well, there is something that's left over. Whether or not we want to characterize the ontology of it, is there not something that's left over?
Yeah,
there is something that's left over, but Dennett, for one, does not. So he's, again, like Ryle, is, I think, fundamentally a pragmatist about this, and saying that there is something that's left over, but it's so ephemeral, so amorphous, and it is not what we think it is. Let me pull in Churchland again on this, that Churchland he calls himself an eliminative materialist, which is somebody that believes this mental talk is all nonsense. And from what we said of what is it like to be a bad article, it seems like that would be just completely counterintuitive nonsense. How can you deny that you're having a conscious experience right now? You can't. But the way the Churchland explains it is what the eliminative materialist is eliminating is a certain explanatory talk. And a lot of the way we talk about the mental is not really referring specifically to conscious states. So when I said we have beliefs, we have desires, this is a folk theory of people's behavior. So somebody acts weird, and you say, why did the person act like that? Well, because they had these weird desires. They have certain wrong information. So it's an explanatory theory, but these entities, beliefs, desires, those are not actually the contents of consciousness. Those are not the qualia that you were talking about. That's not what it's like to, it's like this is supposed to be something that exists over time in us, and it determines part of what, like these are theoretical entities that are posited. And what Churchland is going to say is that there are better theories available, that there's not going to be a one-to-one correspondence between my belief that Obama is president and brain state Q, because maybe the way that things are actually stored is just not like that. It's not that we have this belief is stored in this neuron and this belief is stored in this neuron, and that's just a wacky way, which when you think about it that way, at least it makes more sense. So Dennett has another article called Beyond Belief, where he talks specifically about this folk psychology and trying to replace this with something better. So
well,
that's,
I mean,
that's less absurd
we're now talking about
the article that we actually read by Dennett.
I think it's absurd.
Dennett likes to try to be as obnoxious and confrontational as he can to try to, he's trying to be like Nietzsche. He's trying to stretch your mind and blow your mind and give you new ways of thinking stuff. So he's saying it's not just that I'm attacking these weird entities called beliefs that I frankly have before reading anything like Dennett had problems with, because sometimes a belief is conscious, sometimes it's not. It just seems like there's something not respectable about it in terms of what a psychologist would come up with to explain behavior. There are finer grained ways of dealing with it.
See, these words like respectable, these are the types of words that come up, and the implication, this is why I say there's no arguments in Dennett. These words like what's respectable, or it's taking the fact of the problem and then saying, well, because it's a problem and science does X, Y, and Z, and it can't be integrated into science, then it's not respectable, or it's to be wished away or explained away or something like that.
All right. Well, we're not actually dealing with non-conscious intentionality stuff like beliefs and desires, so I shouldn't talk about that. But this is supposed to be a special and more controversial case, to the case of qualia itself, which is not to deny, when I say, right here, I'm looking at red, it's not to deny that there's not something going on there in your conscious mind. He's not denying Nagel's point. He's denying that that is expressible as a proposition.
It doesn't need to be expressible as a proposition.
Let's actually give a few of the little examples that he gives, or unless somebody else wants to take this up. Are you completely in agreement with Wes about this last article, and we should just stop talking about it because it's so obviously absurd?
I have to say that I am. I am in agreement with Wes.
Which article are we talking about?
Quining qualia is the name of the article. He's saying the notion of qualia as a theoretical entity has major problems with it. He gives like 10 different thought experiments that are supposed to tease this out. And these are all against... I don't want to go into a lot of the details here.
The coffee tasters one. They're all getting towards the same thing.
Okay, there are two guys. They're professional coffee tasters. They both used to like the coffee that they are in charge of tasting. Now neither of them likes it anymore. One of them says, my taste buds have just kind of moldered over the years, and so it just doesn't taste as good to me because I just don't have the capacity to taste so well. And, if I could only get that fixed, then I'm sure it would taste just fine. The other guy says, it doesn't taste good to me either anymore. However, it's not that my taste buds have degraded. It's that my attitude, my tastes have changed. So in other words, the qualia is the same as it always was. I just don't like it anymore. And the other one is saying my qualia is different, and therefore I don't like it anymore. And he's saying that there's no theoretical way. The influence of memory is such that you can't actually tell the difference between these people.
Right. They would need some outside help to figure out which case is the one. Is it the memory that's faulty, or is it the sense apparatus?
So it could be that the guy that thinks his taste buds have degraded can taste just as well as he could before. He just doesn't like that taste anymore. And this is a version, I think, of something that you, Wes, like to rip on, which is that the believer in qualia is buying, to some extent, the idea that there is just a given that is this is just the raw taste of the thing that's unmixed with my attitude about it, or my actions regarding it, or my history regarding it, or whatever, that it's just this raw given. Whereas somebody like Kant, for instance, would say, no, every bit of our experience is chock full of not just the raw feel of the thing, the taste of the thing for me, but my attitude towards it, and there's just no way in our experience that we can tease these apart.
Okay, but
so
it doesn't...
He's a freaking Kantian.
Yeah, I know. He's not... You can call him a Kantian. Look, we know experience is theory-laden. And that's why, when I see this, it's like, you think you invented the idea of something being theory-laden, or the fact that all these things come to bear on this particular experience? But I don't think that's the point. To say that they don't have knowledge, that they can't say which has happened, whether or not...
their taste has changed,
yeah,
or their ability to taste.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that there's not a qualia there to which they have access. Those are comparative. First of all, you're talking about comparisons to memory. You're already talking about a higher...
Right. Conceptualization means comparison to memory. Right. And this is entirely the point.
Yeah, but that's not... We're talking about the subjective feel of it, not whether they can make higher order judgments about what is producing this particular qualia. Yes, there's a background that makes it feel one way or another, and yes, they may not be able to make accurate judgments about what that background is, but that doesn't bear on their access to the qualia itself. It just bears on their access to the background. That's a typical rebuttal to Dennett's. I didn't come up with that myself, obviously.
Even though there's problems with qualia in that sense, that you may be misremembering the way something tasted before, that doesn't remove the fact that there is something there. There's a particular something that it is to be in this situation or to be tasting something. And yeah, sure, you could be thinking, I'm tasting orange juice, and in fact you're tasting something completely different based on the fact that somebody has messed around with your sense perception or your memory of what orange juice tastes like. But the fact that it's still there, that particular qualia is still there, I think it just can't be explained away. It sounds almost like he's saying that because we can't make use of it or we can't be sure about it, then it might as well not exist.
Well, he's saying it cannot form a concept. What he's given is a version of Wittgenstein's private language argument, which we'll read the Philosophical Investigations eventually. But that is to say that unless something is publicly available, I can point to it and you can point to it and we can discuss it, then we can't be sure we're using a concept correctly. That's Wittgenstein's private language argument in very short form. So in the same way, if we want to say, I'm uncovering a fact, this is what red feels like. This is what seeing red feels like to me. Well, we think that's conceptual because then, look, I'm now having another red experience. That's like the first red experience. They're both red experiences. I categorize things like this all the time. And Dennett wants to say that we think that we, again, like he's going to characterize Descartes as thinking this, that we cannot be wrong about the contents of our consciousness. But the fact is, whenever memory comes in, which it always does, if we're referring to anything beyond this immediate thing now, then this introduces the capacity for things to go even systematically. Yeah.
And here's another straw man thing. Of course, he doesn't tell us who, he gives these 4 things which qualia are supposed to have, and he doesn't tell us who said it, and there are a lot of theorists who use qualia and they don't, for instance. And even if you wanted to say qualia were incorrigible, and that doesn't mean all the contents of our consciousness are incorrigible. So you can be wrong about stuff like that, and you can be conceptually wrong, but it doesn't mean that you're wrong about the having of the qualia itself.
Right, and I think the wrongness part of it, when it comes to being wrong, is when you actually start comparing it to something else.
Yeah.
But
right, when you're making a claim at all about it. That's the rightness or wrongness. You can't...
Well, no, except for the claim that you're actually having it.
Yeah, exactly. Just the bare, ostensive claim that, I'm having a taste now.
Yeah, or I'm having something. Right.
And then when you want to elaborate that and say, it's like this in the past, and it belongs to this concept, and this and that, you can start becoming mistaken, absolutely.
Sure.
So I read this as being against Chalmers, David Chalmers, that we'll put a link to one of his articles that's a good overview of a lot of these different theories. He's a property dualist, which we have not distinguished between substance dualists and property dualists, but property dualists are basically people that buy, the mind just is the body in a certain sense, but the properties of mind are irreducible to the properties of body, and so a lot of the same problems are sticking around. Well, then how can these properties affect each other? Anyway, so Chalmers' larger project, I got his book, The Conscious Mind in Search of a Fundamental Theory, which is from 96 or so.
Yeah, I started reading that too.
And his positive theory, so I kind of jumped, he spends the first half of it arguing about dualism and why some form of dualism, some sort of non-reduction has to be the case, which again, I think there are very few people that deny that. But then when he actually gets to the positive part, what he does is he says, even though there's something irreducible about consciousness, we can still talk about the correlations between conscious phenomena and brain states or functional states. And he spends a lot of time then doing exactly what the physicalist, exactly what the functionalist, exactly what the identity theorist does. He really does think that this is an important part of what understanding the mind is about, even though he characterizes it as the easy problem as opposed to the mind-body problem, which is the hard problem. He still spends a good amount of time on the easy problem, and I find it interesting as well, the various folks that write about this.
Yeah, I like that. I'm interested in the easy problem, too. I just think that, again, this is temperamental, too, and Dennett style rubs me the wrong way, and accurately or not, I get that vibe that he wants the hard problem to go away, and that he's going to come up with any bit of smoke and mirrors to make it go away. So that may not be fair, but if it's not Dennett, I'm sure there's someone out there who's like that, and that's the person that I hate.
Yes, all right.
But.
And just to be specific about what Dennett might object to about Chalmers' method is that the prime part of his theory of consciousness, at least in the couple chapters that I was reading, is this theory of coherence, which involves assumptions like my memory is generally reliable. Because we have to rely on first-person reports, if we're going to do any kind of brain study and we're going to say which neurons are connected with you thinking of your mother, I have to ask you if you're thinking of your mother now. So yes, so he says we make these psychophysical, even people that are trying to just study the brain really assume that there's a general coherence between the brain states and the self-reports. And this, I think, as a methodological point, is something that Dennett is going to have problems with and is going to say, we need to put more effort into investigating other ways of figuring out, because it seems like physiologically, maybe you could look at the two coffee tasters and say which of the two theories is correct, but you're not going to figure that out from their experience. Again, it's making a methodological point. And I'm kind of sick of all these temperamental discussions. I like both sides. It's a complete problem to be solved, like you were saying, the easy problem and the hard problem, or however less objectionably you want to put it. So there's no reason for all this fighting. It reminds me of when we were in the philosophy department and there were certain people, like those logicians that Seth was referring to earlier, that considered what a lot of the other faculty were doing to be just not philosophy. Oh, they're just not serious. They're not real philosophers. They're
the old continental analytic thing.
Yes, it's ideological objections. And I hate this in all forms of life. Like when I read movie reviews, I'm fine reading a movie review that says, this was just inept. The direction was awful. The script was bad. But what I can't stand is when the reviewer just doesn't like the ideology behind the movie being made this way. Oh, these characters were just unlikable.
Exactly, right.
Like, maybe they're supposed to be fucking unlikable.
Right. Yeah, you got to judge them by their own light. So it's a popcorn movie.
Yes.
Action movie. Oh, lots of explosions. Well,
so it seems like that shouldn't apply to philosophy because philosophy is, about making cogent arguments. But there's so much that's subjective about what you actually find enlightening, what you find clears up your understanding of things that you perceived as problems. That, come on, just put yourself in other people's shoes to find why they would find these problems interesting and see what you get out of it reading that way. I will admit maybe that my interest in Dennett is because he's one of the first people. Like this Consciousness Explained book was, it got a hell of a lot of press.
Yeah, I know. I read that book. I was excited about it. Yeah. I read it when I was younger, and I think I was like 17 when I read it. And I was excited, and
I still haven't read more than 150 pages of it. So, I've skipped around a little bit.
But I think we're having the same reaction in opposite directions. Anyway. It's the open-mindedness thing, and you want to be open-minded, and for me, it's in a negative direction where I think of Dennett as someone closed-minded. So I'm not open-minded to his closed-mindedness or something like that. But
you just got to ignore some of the...
I get enough of Dennett from people who have integrated some of his insights and, if he has any.
Yes, as I had to point out to Wes on an email that he seemed to be the most cited person on the.
But again, that's because he's a popularizer who has
of consciousness.
Yeah, but he's a popularizer who writes in an entertaining way, and this is the other thing. It's like the corrupting the youth. Maybe I want to execute the latest Socrates, but he's a popularizer. I think of not the strongest positions.
I find it weird that all these guys, I'm talking about the Chalmers book, I'm talking about the Nagel book, I'm talking about this particular Searle book, that whereas in a regular science, you present things to your colleagues and you refine them or whatever, that all these books are written so that a non-technical audience could potentially get them, and they're very fully fleshed out, even in these discussions of, the neuroscience and whatever, in such a way that like, is this primary source or is this secondary source? Like, I don't even freaking know anymore.
Yeah.
Like, isn't this the wrong forum, writing a giant book and giving it to the public at large? Isn't this the wrong forum for putting forth your detailed theory of consciousness that should instead be mulled over in an interdisciplinary way by experts? And it really leaves me, and it's not just Dennett, like, these other guys do it the same way, and it leaves me kind of, again, feeling puzzled and inept about, like, how do I judge between some of these things? I don't know if you're saying, oh, this approach is more fruitful in terms of research. Like, I just don't know enough about, I don't know if anybody does. That's the point. It's a freaking interdisciplinary mess. and when we were in the CogSci courses, and we were having, like, the AI guy talk to us, right, Marco? Mm-hmm. Like, that guy clearly didn't know what the hell was going on in the philosophy end. There's just so little communication. I mean, maybe that's the use of these massive understandable books, is because there's such a need to reach across disciplinary boundaries that it's not so much that this is aimed at housewives across the country are going to read The Conscious Mind.
Well, Consciousness Explained did sell a lot of copies. You know, it's like Steven Pinker and other. I mean, there's a popular philosophy and popular science audience, you know.
I'd like to be popular.
Well, we're soon going to corner the market on this.
Popularizing
philosophy.
Yes. And yet we're never going to get the approval of the snobs because we really aren't that qualified, frankly.
No, I think we are that qualified. But, you know, as an academic, you learn to be very careful about what you say because you don't ever want to be caught with even your pants a little bit down, right? We can afford to be speculative and just throw stuff out there and not be worried about being wrong and not being worried about not looking like an expert. But there are a lot of academics with less of a grasp on the, you know?
Maybe that's one thing I like about William James and about Dennett, that they're not afraid to talk in a semi-poetic whatever. They're not to Nietzsche extent. They're still trying to be systematic or whatever, but they're not that careful. Which is probably what you object to exactly, in Dennett at least.
I like James, yeah. James is a great writer.
Yeah, so the reason that I was getting a bad smell from Nagel and from, I didn't know enough about Chalmers to have that, was that I thought that Nagel in particular, his view implied that, we just can't know anything, so therefore we stop. All this philosophy, all this neuroscience and whatever you're doing is a load of crap, and we just can't know the end of story. Whereas when I actually looked at The View from Nowhere, and he even says at the end of this, what is it like to be a bad article? He says, we can do some phenomenology. There are other ways of objectifying experience. Like, there is still work to be done. And in fact, he thinks this is work that will be obscured if you'd focus just on the neuroscience. And I think that was your objection, at least Wes, to Dennett, is that, if you focus only on the neuroscience and these functionalist explanations or whatever, then you're going to neglect the part that Chalmers is doing, for instance.
Well, I mean, here's my position. I do lean towards thinking that it's not solvable, but I don't think any philosophical problem is, and that's not a reason to stop trying, or not a reason to stop trying to do it in an interdisciplinary way. And so, you know, I'll always be looking at neuroscience books as well and all that stuff. But I mean, it's
you have the patience for that shit?
I love neuroscience.
As someone who, in theory, espouses neuroscience, I've taken neuroscience classes.
No, I took a neuroscience.
I've retained almost none of that.
When you get into it intensely, I've taken a neuroscience class. It starts to become depressing, actually, because you do start to feel like just a big piece of brain meat and nothing else. But
I like popular neuroscience. You know, easy books.
Yeah. And there's a guy named Colin McGinn who is that. You know, he does think in principle we can never solve the problem, and I'm sympathetic to that view. But, you know, again, to me, it's whether or not you're doing what I think of as the philosophical thing and fleshing out these fundamental problems and just banging your head against the wall, but in a pleasurable way. Or you think you're going to really get to some definitive answer. I think it's worthwhile either way to keep going.
Masochist.
Yeah. You masochist. That's what philosophy. Yeah, philosophy is being a masochist. Didn't Socrates say that? Yeah.
In many ways, it's more about the pursuit than the end. And how you go about it.
As Nietzsche put it, philosophy is a woman.
Oh, that's not bringing Nietzsche's terrible attitude towards women.
Oh, God. You're gonna cut that out, be politically correct.
Oh, no, we can leave it in there.
Doesn't mean that I...
Right. You attributed it to somebody else.
It's been attributed to someone else, exactly.
So, Seth, are you bored yet? We're just about done. What do you have to say about this? What does this all mean to you?
Oh, gosh. Are we at the summing up stage now?
I would think so.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I'll say this. Not having a background in the subject matter, when I read the articles that you provided, Mark, at first I thought there were like two totally different threads. There was kind of the AI Turing thread and then the dualism. And I didn't really initially understand how the two things were going to come together. And I have a number of my own biases that I bring to bear to the artificial intelligence discussion. But as I mentioned, talking about the Searle Chinese room argument, I kind of see where the two things come together. And I remain firmly convinced of at least two or three things. One is that I have a unique subjective experience, and I have to assume that other people have their own unique subjective experience to which I do not have direct access. I have to infer from their behavior what their internal experience is, or I have to imagine myself in their place. That's called empathy and this sort of thing. So one thing is I believe that's the case. The second is that this whole thing about how that in turn is related to brain and body and is a complete mystery to me. And I think it is a fundamentally deep and challenging philosophical question. A third thing is, I think the attempt to replicate human cognition with computers is fundamentally misguided and also probably not achievable. So I believe in weak AI and not strong AI, if you want to put it that way. And that's kind of my summation of where I'm at.
Is it misguided because the robots will take over the world, or?
No, well, it's misguided because even if you assume that it's achievable, the amount of effort that would be expended to accomplish it would not justify the actual end result. It's kind of how I feel about space travel. Let's put it that way. The amount of money and time and energy that we spend trying to put up space shuttles and have astronauts fly up there versus what that money could be spent on. I don't know. I guess maybe in that sense, I'm sort of a market-driven pragmatist, which is why I think nobody's accomplished it either, is that nobody's seen the intrinsic value isn't there. There's a lot better things that people could be spending their time doing and spending their money doing.
Yeah, I think I agree with, actually agree. My position is very similar to yours, Seth, except perhaps with one difference, which I don't necessarily think that the efforts of AI are misguided. I do think that there is something that we can get out of that. And the proof is really in the idea of space travel. I mean, how else would we have gotten pens that can write upside down? It's just,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
Yes, that's a very good point. I stand corrected.
And the moon landing inspired a nation.
Exactly.
I don't know if you just don't follow tech news like I tend to, Seth, but I feel like there's always going to be a substantial segment of the population, and it's many of the same people that are so excited about the iPad and whatever, that as soon as circuit speeds and the sort of the raw hardware technology improve enough to make an improvement of software of artificial intelligence possible, it's happening. It's just a freaking matter of time before we have our protocol droids running around and crap like that. Like, there's so many things that would be useful to have a flexibly thinking machine, whether you want to call it conscious or not, but just that can do something that would be hard to describe in a way other than thinking. Is just a matter of time.
I think that whether computation, strict algorithms will get us there, that's another question. Whether or not we can create something physical that's going to do things that replicate consciousness in the general sense,
Yes. I'll refer people again to that Chinese room article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that it really goes into a bunch of different views of AI proponents of really how something that would be convincingly mental would have to be constructed.
Yeah, well,
that's not what Turing is talking about.
I'm going to respond very quickly and just say there's a much bigger issue in the programming than there is in the platform.
Agreed, yeah.
Well,
maybe it won't be more efficient than just having kids. Maybe it'll never be efficient to do it.
Well, you got to understand something before you can program it. So if you can point me to the person who understands the human mind well enough to be able to say, oh, well, this is how you would have to instantiate it on this particular computational platform. But I think that in itself is still a huge complex.
It's going to have more lines of code than Windows. That's how bad it is.
Maybe we're more likely to have the genetic engineering and things before we have robots that like we just breed dumb slaves instead of artificially create in a lab instead of trying to make a robot that's a dumb slave.
We'll be able to grow brain meat on vines and then...
I thought it very interesting that this is my closing thought that's kind of irrelevant, but I just forgot to say it earlier. So there was this book that I read some of that was like philosophy and Star Wars, that, there are all these popular philosophy and Buffy and didn't you mention having that?
Oh yeah, I have philosophy and Buffy and philosophy and Angel. I think I have a couple others too.
Yes.
They're terrible articles, by the way.
For the most part, yeah. And it's always just like, oh, here's an excuse to talk historically about Schopenhauer. No, come on. I don't want to see how Moe from The Simpsons is Schopenhauerian here. But there's some amusing juxtaposition in these things. They're worth flipping through. So one of the ones that I was looking through about Star Wars was talking pretty much like, surely R2-D2 and C-3PO are sentient in any sense of the word, and the fact that the characters treat them like slaves and turn them off whenever they want and stuff means they're bad. And then I thought it was funny that maybe in response to that kind of sentiment that there was something that our heroes were doing wrong in the satanic prequels that George Lucas put out later, he made a point of having the characters say, it's a good thing that robots can't think or none of us would be here. Like that, they really are just simulacra.
Really?
He agrees with Searle that they're given personalities, just like, Marvin in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, just to sort of make them more amusing to us. But no, you should not identify with them. They do not have inner lives.
Really? They didn't...
You got to do your textual analysis of episode 2 there.
I'd rather never see those prequels again, frankly.
My kids like them.
I don't think Jar Jar Binks is sentient.
That's all right.
Or the person who came up with the idea for him. So.
That is the other side of this whole, that ultimately it's supposed to be a moral thing that's driving whether we care whether these things are sentient or not. And, if they're sentient, then we must treat them as moral persons. But then they're just even in the Star Wars universe, there are alien races created that are purposely so heinous that you should not care about killing them.
Right.
The insect creatures or whatever. That being sentient is not a sufficient condition for having our moral respect.
Right.
Yeah, that would make a lot of things simpler. Just combine philosophy of mind and ethics together.
I actually thought of that earlier, and I didn't say it, but I guess you kind of what if my criteria for consciousness was whether or not I could stand in some sort of moral relationship to a thing?
Yeah.
So the robot would never be the case unless I could actually feel as though I could wrong or be wronged by it.
Yeah,
which happens when they start to
Like
bitch.
I said, the robot has to be hot. And being ugly or not ugly is more of a criteria.
I didn't say have sex with it, Wes. I said have them stand in a moral relationship.
I know. I was thinking about the insects.
You're talking about Starship Troopers, right?
No, I wasn't thinking of that, but then you mentioned that afterwards, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my customary rants in the area of ethics, that really as soon as a species or whatever gets smart enough to ask for rights, then you should give it to them. When the chimps rise up, I will give them animal rights when the chimp can sign at me. Do I have a soul?
What about babies, though? Babies.
I'm saying it is a sufficient condition for giving them rights, not that it's a necessary condition for giving them rights.
I'm sympathetic to that.
All right.
But you didn't tell me about babies.
Oh, fuck babies. I don't want to talk about babies right now. We'll deal with abortion and babies.
I was thinking about, rights.
Possibly
rights
in some
to
future
things
episodes.
that can't ask for them. But.
No, I think what he's trying to say is that when the insects bomb our planet in Starship Troopers, it is similar to a Declaration of Rights. But while we must recognize them as sentient beings, it does not mean that we don't go to war with them and blow them up.
Yeah, what about the V's? That was a horrible series, by the way.
Show?
Oh my God, it's horrible. Do you agree?
No, I'm not going to go with horrible. I'm going to go with disappointing.
I thought the script...
You watched the original?
Yeah, I remember the original.
No, not the original, the latest one.
I've missed a few episodes, but I've seen a few of them too. It has the woman from Firefly, so that kind of counts for something.
Don't get me wrong, I found myself watching episode after episode, even though I was thinking, God, this is fucking awful. What is wrong with me? But it's, it's sci-fi, and it's people who are lizards underneath, and, so it's got all the right
it's also
ingredients.
No, you're right, Wes. It's disappointing, but because it promised so little, not so much of a disappointment. Flash forward, those kinds of, that's like, it's like, oh, I'm gonna tease you. I'm gonna kind of be like Lost, the first couple of seasons that didn't suck, and then it's just like, oh my god.
But just the amount of bad dialogue and
the writing in these shows
plot
is always
holes,
bad.
just ridiculous,
Nah.
plot holes. It's like,
Hey man, take it on its own.
No. That is on its own. That's coherence theory. That's it can be about aliens. It can be the most. It's not about the plausibility of aliens. It's about the plausibility of someone hiring a known terrorist because they think no one else can help them fight the aliens. So
look for Wes's forthcoming paper. The correspondence theory of science fiction television shows.
The coherence
The coherence theory of science fiction television shows.
Speaking of writing academic articles about popular culture, I have a friend who just published an essay in the Worlds of Back to the Future, critical essays on the films. It's like very esoteric, Lacanian, and all kinds of continental philosophy type.
We could have an episode on some shit like that in the future.
This is what our fans want, Mark.
This is what our fan wants, Mark.
You guys complaining about V.
All right. Shall we say goodnight?
So thanks to everybody. Please go look at partiallyexaminedlife.com. Thanks, Marco, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. It was fun.
So good night.
Good night.
Good night.
And take my heart. Choose the habit you want to start. I don't know if you speak my tongue. Put a leg out and I will come. No mind. My son to see it's real. Roll your eyes back and let you feel. Roll yourself out up into the breeze. Shift serenely as your partner starts to wave. Then disconnect me for doing what you please. No mind. No mind. I'm coming your way, she said before think that she'll stick around. Maybe